Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Ukraine peace talks take place in Riyadh between the US and Russia. Thousands of protesters are arrested on the streets of Turkey as Istanbul's mayor faces corruption charges. Israel strikes a target at hospital, killing a senior Hamas leader. And Canada goes to the polls. Newly elected Prime Minister Mark Carney calls a snap election just 9 days in the job. To our top story, and talks between the US and Russia are taking place in Saudi Arabia today as the two countries discuss a potential peace deal in Ukraine. Ukraine met with the US in Riyadh over the weekend, with one member of the Ukrainian delegation revealing talks were constructive and meaningful. Today, Grigor Karizan, chair of Moscow's Foreign Affairs Committee, told Russian state media negotiations were going on creatively. The talks are taking place following drone attacks from both Russia and Ukraine over the weekend, with 3 people killed in Kyiv and 4 military helicopters destroyed in Russia. The US and Ukraine will hold another round of talks following today's discussions between the US and Ukraine. Let's go live to Istanbul now to speak to John Kavalic, Senior Editor for Outcome Modelling Analysis at Issue Insight. John, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Today's discussions will include the safety of shipping in the Black Sea. Can you tell us why the Black Sea is so important to today's negotiations?
When the Russian Federation began its attack on the 24th of February 2022, part of it was targeted toward Odessa, the main Black Sea seaport, along with other smaller ports along the Ukraine territories of the Black Sea. And then there were issues relating to the movement of agricultural commodities from Ukraine through the Black Sea, through the Bosphorus, and then to markets onward. The Russian Federation started basically threatening and then attacking the shipping, the commercial shipping. And so President Erdogan, the United Nations General Secretary Gutierrez, they put together the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And what that was designed to bring Russia, to bring Ukraine together and basically say, okay, we're gonna create this imaginary straight line from the port of Odessa and the near ports to the Bosphorus. And that worked for a while, but then President Putin decided he didn't want to do it anymore. And the attacks then continued on commercial vessels, not that much, but it was the threat that made a lot of commercial vessels not want to take a chance because the insurance companies were saying, we're not going to insure them. The Ukrainian government got creative and they said, okay, well, first we'll put together an insurance pot. So we'll self-insure. So we'll put a pot of money together. We'll take care of any loss with the vessels. So that solved one problem. The second was the routing. So rather than this straight line, what the ships have done since is hug the coast of Hungary and Romania and Slovakia and on their way to the Bosphorus. And so it's, adds some time, it's less efficient, but it works. And so the problem is now that there's no longer this Black Sea Grain Initiative to really negotiate. So what both parties have moved to is, okay, what about just let's not blow things up in the Black Sea?
John, I just wanted to ask you there, the US and Ukraine will hold another round of talks. We're hearing this today following today's discussions between America and Russia. In your opinion, do you think this is a positive sign that they are making headway in these negotiations?
Well, you certainly can look at this from the perspective of, are the last 2 days better than President Zelensky's 20 minutes in the Oval Office a month ago? And the answer is yes. When the Ukrainians are talking to the U.S. on Sunday, And then the U.S. is talking to the Russians on Monday, and then the U.S. is talking to the Ukrainians on Tuesday, even though this is at what's called the technical level. So these are basically the level below the foreign ministers, below the secretaries. However, the Ukrainian delegation is led by their defense minister. So that shows that they're trying to make something happen, and he does have the credibility and he does have the authority to make some decisions. So that's really good. The fact that they're meeting again tomorrow is hopefully going to be building on the meetings that were held today between the U.S. and the Russians. So this is all about, in diplomatic parlance, confidence-building measures. Basically what both governments do, the Russians and the Ukrainians, they make lists, and it's basically what's most important at the top, and then you go all the way down to least important. But then when it comes to these talks, you flip those lists and you start with what's easiest, and then you work your way toward what's hardest. So it's building confidence to get rid of the small issues, make it so that both sides are getting more and more comfortable, and then you try for the final, which is President Trump wanting a ceasefire, meaning just stop shooting.
Yes, indeed. And last time when Trump and Putin spoke on the phone last week, a quick ceasefire deal seemed unlikely, further away than we actually thought. The Trump administration are now hoping a truce could be called by Easter. That's not far away. It's the 20th of April. Do you think this is at all possible? Remember, Donald Trump said he would stop this war in his first day in office.
As he actually said during the campaign, he'd stop it in 24 hours, and then he said he'd stop it even before he became president, so during the transition. And then more recently, he's come out and said he was basically being sarcastic. Putting that aside, is this doable? It is. President Trump has invested a lot in it. However, what he does well is a normal politician gets invested in an issue, and then they become hostage to the issue, where they can't maneuver because now they're hostage to whatever happens. It's good, it's bad, it sinks, it swims. President Trump has, during his first term and thus far, it's incredible when I say this, I mean, he's only 60 days into the term. It feels like he's been there for years. But he is able to walk away. He's able to get disgusted, or there's a new shiny object that attracts his attention, and he walks away. He's sort of done that with the mineral deal. The mineral deal with Ukraine, it was, 50 billion, 100 billion, 500 billion. Oh, it was $1 trillion. But then when
John Cavillage, Senior Editor for Outcome and Modelling Analysis at Issue Insight. I think we're having a few technical problems there, but thank you so much for joining me. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. 199 migrants deported from the US have arrived in Venezuela. Footage showed young men in sweatsuits walking off the plane, some of them smiling and clapping. The flight comes after Venezuela announced an agreement with Washington to resume repatriation flights from the US. A US delegation led by Usha Vance, the wife of Vice President J.D. Vance, will travel to Greenland this week. The visit follows President Trump's continued threats to annex the Danish territory. White House National Security Advisor Mike Waltz and Energy Secretary Chris Wright will also join the group. South Korea's Constitutional Court has reinstated Prime Minister Han Duck-soo as acting president. Han was impeached just 2 weeks into his role, and Deputy Premier Cho Sang-mok has led the country since. The East Asian democracy is going through severe political turmoil ever since Yoon Suk-yeol declared martial law in December last year. And the CEO of the British National Grid claims Heathrow Airport had enough power from other substations despite Friday's shutdown. Thousands of flights to and from London's biggest airport were affected last week after a fire consumed an electricity substation powering the key hub. Responding to the claims, a Heathrow spokesperson said it would not have been possible for the airport to operate uninterrupted. Now, 1,133 people have been arrested in Turkey after 5 days of protests, according to the country's government. The demonstrations broke out when Istanbul's mayor, Ekrem İmamoğlu, a rival of President Erdogan, was held on Wednesday over corruption charges. İmamoğlu says the charges are politically motivated and accusation Erdogan does deny. We can now speak to Cengiz Firat, a retired ambassador from the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Good evening to you, Ambassador. Thank you for joining me. So in 2016, there was a failed coup attempt in Turkey. What has sparked the latest democratic movement against President Erdogan?
Good evening from Turkey. Well, the latest developments are definitely very, very important, and it's been on the news everywhere around the world. One thing that could be said is that it's the first time since the Gezi protests, which took place in 2013, that we see such mass protestation going on around the country. The Mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu, of course, as you know, was arrested and on corruption charges. And pending the result of the court hearings, he will be taken off duty from the position. Now, when you look at what the opposition is saying, the CHP, the main opposition party to which Ekrem İmamoğlu belongs, they're saying that this is a politically motivated development because they see, and most of the commentators around the world seem to see the same thing, that President Erdogan is getting rid of his political rivals, in a sense, taking them off the political agenda where they can no longer be a rival to him in the next general election. As Mr. İmamoğlu has been able to beat his political rivals in Istanbul and claim the mayor's position in the biggest city of Turkey, he was a natural candidate to become the next, he was poised to become the next candidate from the CHP for the presidential elections. And the CHP seems to think, and Mr. Ekrem İmamoğlu seems to think, and he says this, that everything is done in such a political way that on the 23rd, which was yesterday, as the party was about to inform that he would be the next presidential candidate from the CHP, this whole process of corruption charges, of links to terrorism, etc., was brought about as a political move rather than a natural progression of things in politics. So what has happened since then? We've seen, of course, for the past 4 or 5 days, mass demonstrations, mainly by students, to be honest, and mainly in the big cities, because there's a ban on demonstrations. So it's the students who are taking the forefront on this. And they're not as big as the Gezi protests. And when you look at the Conservative Party, they're not talking about it too much. Their supporters are just watching all the developments. So in reality, what's happening on the ground is that there are protests, but they're mainly student protests. But what's very important, much more important than the student protests, is what happened yesterday. Yesterday, the CIA actually kind of ballot by themselves to choose.
Ambassador, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but we seem to be having a few technical problems. Just let me know if you can hear me on the line, please.
I can hear you.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, great. It seems, yes, I can hear you now. I just wanted to pick up on something that happened yesterday. Millions of people actually went out to vote, and for Ekrem Imamoglu. He was a real fierce communicator. Why is he so popular, especially with the younger generation? Because what you said to me, most of the people that are out demonstrating are students.
Well, the reason why it's students is because there's a protest. Yesterday, able to go and vote candidate, going to elect their candidate, who's going to be opposed to the president, who's going to be the candidate for the CHP in the next election. CHP, mind that's 1.6 million members, and yesterday over 15 million.
Ambassador, I'm so sorry. We're actually just going to have to end it there. We're having a few technical problems and we're struggling to get you on the line. But thank you so much for joining me. I hope I have you back on soon. Cengiz Firat, a retired ambassador from the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you very much. Let's take another look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. Some Europeans are reconsidering their travel plans as a result of President Trump's actions. That's according to a number of travel agents across the continent. A change in US-EU relations, global trade wars and tougher immigration policies are believed to be behind the change. Europeans spent $155 billion travelling to the US in 2023. The number of Western European visitors has fallen 1% year-on-year in February. Now, the French actor Gérard Depardieu appeared in court in Paris earlier today, facing accusations of sexual assault. The 76-year-old is alleged to have groped a 54-year-old set dresser and a 34-year-old assistant director during production of Les Voleurs. The actor denies the charges. Pope Francis has made a return to the Vatican after a 5-week stay in hospital for double pneumonia. A car carrying the pontiff travelled through Rome, accompanied by police. It's the 88-year-old's first public appearance since mid-February. And Disney's live-action version of Snow White has topped the North American box office, despite a number of very critical reviews. The film has taken an estimated $87.3 million during its opening weekend. That is, however, below expectations for a movie which reportedly costs more than $270 million to make. An Israeli airstrike on a hospital in Gaza has killed a senior Hamas leader and also their aide. The group's head of financial affairs, Ishmael Barum, was targeted at Nasser Hospital, the main medical facility in Khan Yunis. Israel said the planned attack took place following an extensive intelligence gathering process. Hamas said many others, including medical personnel, were injured in that very strike. I'm now joined by the former Israeli government spokesman, Eldin Levy. Thank you so much for joining me, Eldin. First of all, more than 50,000 people have now been killed in Gaza since the Israel-Hamas war. That's according to Gaza's health ministry. This is a real stark number. Does Israel have no other choice but to keep bombarding Gaza?
Possible, I would be very skeptical of the numbers that are being provided by the Hamas terror regime, which, as everyone knows, doesn't distinguish between civilians and combatants. But what really matters is who is being killed. Every civilian death is a tragedy, and there should be as few of those as possible. But every Hamas militant death, well, that's exactly what Israel is trying to achieve in this war that Hamas started. Hamas invaded on October 7th, fired thousands of rockets into Israel, took over 250 Israelis hostage, and Israel says that this war has to end with the total destruction of Hamas's military machine, because otherwise Hamas will do this over and over again. That is what will happen if Israel does not succeed in destroying Hamas. And it's tragic that civilians are being killed, but civilians are being killed because Hamas deliberately fights out of civilian buildings, in civilian dress, out of a deliberate strategy to try to use its own civilians as human shields or human sacrifices. And that sick strategy has to stop.
2 Hamas leaders were killed in Israeli airstrikes over the weekend. How significant is this for Israel?
Very significant. Israel has been clear that every Hamas terrorist is a dead man walking, because the Hamas terror regime that perpetrated the October 7th massacre is threatening to do it again and again. Of the 20 members of Hamas's Politburo on the eve of the war, over 11 of those have now been killed, including Ismail Barhoum, who was hiding inside a hospital. And Israel is very clear this war has to end, and it has to end when Hamas is defeated, or when Hamas surrenders and releases all of the hostages. Because Israel cannot allow the Hamas terror regime to continue governing the Gaza Strip. This isn't another round of conflict. This war cannot end with Hamas still in power in Gaza, or it will try to invade Israel again, perpetrate another October 7th massacre again, and we're going to be stuck in the same cycle of violence that we're desperately trying to get out of.
Tens of thousands of protesters have actually taken to the streets of Israel in recent days. They say Netanyahu is only motivated by political gain. They want the hostages home, and they have been demonstrating since Israel started strikes on Gaza again. What is your analysis of the situation and the unrest in Israel?
There is a huge amount of disagreement and debate in Israel about the way that this war is being handled. But I think there's actually a lot more unity within Israeli society than these images suggest. There are people who want Israel to pay any price, pay any ransom to bring the hostages back now. But everyone in Israel agrees that the Hamas terror regime has to be brought down later. No one in Israel thinks that we can continue to live next to the Hamas terror regime as our neighbor. They want to get the hostages out now and destroy the Hamas terror regime later. So the debate inside Israel is not about the goals of the war that Hamas started. It's about the sequencing and how we should go about achieving those goals that everyone agrees on. This war has to end with Hamas no longer governing the Gaza Strip, with all the hostages home, and with no more threat coming from Gaza to Israel.
Hamas is still holding 59 hostages, with 24 of them thought to still be alive. Do you have any idea on the statistics of the hostages at the moment since Israel started its offensive again?
Yeah, Hamas is still holding 59 hostages. They've been stuck for over 530 days since the October 7th massacre. We believe 24 of the hostages are still alive. The rest have already been murdered. And that's just a sign of how evil the Hamas regime is, that it's now holding onto their bodies for a ransom. Hamas just released a video with proof of life of 2 of the hostages. We know from the hostages who are coming back that they are being starved, that they're shackled, that many of them have untreated wounds from October 7th. And Israel is demanding Hamas has to release the hostages immediately and unconditionally. And there is no excuse for holding on to these poor people who were snatched out of their beds 18 months ago.
On Sunday, Netanyahu spoke with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Egypt has also floated a new proposal aimed at restoring the Gaza ceasefire deal. Is there any signal on when these negotiations are going to restart, and if Israel is prepared to be involved?
Well, Israel has found itself having to resume the military campaign because Hamas was refusing to release the hostages. Israel wanted to extend the ceasefire. It agreed to 2 American proposals to extend the ceasefire. We'll carry on the ceasefire, and in exchange, Hamas will give back hostages. And Hamas resumed. So Israel found itself resuming military action because otherwise Hamas was getting a ceasefire for nothing. And Israel is saying it will be willing to go back to negotiations on going back to the ceasefire if Hamas is serious about releasing hostages, not if it's just trying to drag out the talks to buy time and remain in power in Gaza, plotting for the next round of war.
Elon Levy, former Israeli government spokesperson, thank you for joining me.
Anytime.
Let's take a look at the top business news now. Oil prices climbed as investors weighed the impact of fresh US sanctions on Iranian exports against talks to end the war in Ukraine, which could increase supply of Russian crude to global markets. Brent and WTI benchmarks both advanced on Monday. US President Donald Trump also provided traders with some hope that previously announced tariffs in April may not be as much as previously feared. DNA testing company 23andMe has filed for bankruptcy protection and announced that its co-founder and CEO has resigned with immediate effect. The company will now attempt to sell itself under the supervision of a court. Founded in 2006, the company went public in 2021, but has never actually turned a profit. Turning to sports news now, Lando Norris says he's nervous and excited by the prospect of battling teammate Oscar Piastri for the F1 driver's title. Pole sitter Piastri led Norris in a McLaren 1-2 at the Chinese Grand Prix on Sunday, a week after Norris finished atop in the season opener over in Australia. And Novak Djokovic has said chasing the world #1 ranking is not his main objective anymore after winning the Miami Open on Sunday. The 24-year-old Grand Slam champion said he will happily take major tournament victories over the top spot. Djokovic has spent more than 400 weeks at #1 and now sits 5th in the rankings. Canada will go to the polls on the 28th of April after a snap election was called by the newly appointed Prime Minister Mark Carney. Carney, only 9 days in the job, will go head-to-head with Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre as the country battles a trade war with US President Donald Trump, who has referred to Canada as the 51st state of America. Here's how Mark Carney did break the news.
I've just requested that the Governor-General dissolve Parliament and call an election for April 28th. And she has agreed. We are facing the most significant crisis of our lifetimes because of President Trump's unjustified trade actions and his threats to our sovereignty. Our response must be to build a strong economy and a more secure Canada.
I'm now joined in the studio by journalist Michael Jabri-Pickett. Thank you so much for joining me, Michael. A pleasure to have you on set. So we actually just heard from Mark Carney there. He appears to be pinning winning hopes on securing Canada from Donald Trump's tariffs. Is this a wide move for Carney, or is he kind of pigeonholing himself a little bit?
I would say it's the only move. This election is about tariffs and Trump. If you're in Canada and you are trying to decide who you're going to vote for, this is the only issue. And they're so intertwined that 100%, if he's going to be elected as the Prime Minister, then he definitely has to pigeonhole himself.
Very interesting. Carney has also warned Trump about the impact of tariffs on Canada's economy. Of course, we know him in his former life as the governor of the Bank of England. Do you think he is the best person to actually negotiate a good deal for Canada with Donald Trump?
So traditionally, Canadians either vote for Tories or Liberals. So you're either going to have a Conservative government or a Liberal government. And in this particular case, what you have to remember is that Pierre Poilievre, who is the leader of the opposition, of the Tories, he was first elected when he was 25. He's 45. He's a career politician. So what is actually, in some circles, going to hurt Mark Carney is that he's not a politician. I think in his dealings with Trump, it's going to help him because he is going to bring real-world experience. And as we know, Donald Trump is about the art of the deal. And I think Carney's the person that's going to be able to best deal with a fellow businessman.
Yeah, because both of them are traditionally have a business background, so we'll see how Trump reacts to that. Carney is currently unelected. We just spoke a little bit there, taking over from Justin Trudeau, of course. Can he win this election and capitalise on the Liberal Party's success in the last few months? You sort of said there that's where things could be a little bit difficult because he's 60. He's not a career politician. This is his first sort of hurrah into it.
I would say yes. And the reason is because 18 months ago, there's no way that a Liberal leader would be reelected. But the last few months, there's been a shift, and the public is not so enthralled with Justin Trudeau. He had been in power almost 10 years. And what happened is you had Trump come to power, you had Justin Trudeau stepping down, and you had Mark Carney winning the Liberal leadership race. And that perfect storm created a moment, I think, that someone like Mark Carney, with his experience as Governor of Bank of England and Governor of Bank of Canada, I think he's perfectly positioned to capitalize on something that the other traditional politicians would not be able to capitalize on.
Coming in with fresh eyes, I guess. I wanted to talk to you about Canadianos. I hope I've said that right. They've become a regular in coffee shops across Canada. And I found this quite interesting because how are Canadians reacting to Donald Trump and his administration wanting Canada to become the 51st state? Canada and America, traditional allies, so close. You know, what are they thinking?
So the national sport of Canada is ice hockey.
Which you played this morning.
Which I did play this morning.
Know.
And for all the other Canadians out there, I would say actually it's hockey, but because we are speaking to a global audience, it has to be ice hockey. And there's an expression called elbows up. Now, what elbows up means is that when you are going to be fighting for the puck, you need to make sure that you keep a fair distance so that the other players know that they can't get too close to you. So if your elbows are up, you're prepared to defend yourself, but you're not necessarily being the aggressor. That has become a rallying cry across Canada. You have had demonstrations in different cities throughout the country where that cry for elbows up is coming in. And what's happening is that Donald Trump might be motivating Canadian voters better than any Canadian politician because he's brought the country together. It's almost an existential threat right now. And what he's doing is he's making Canadians realize that the one issue that I will stand by every other Canadian with is the fact that our country has to remain our country. An Angus Reid poll recently found that 91% of Canadians are not in favor of becoming the 51st state.
That is a really high number. But I just want to put one other thing to you. If Trump tariffs do come in at what he's threatening for Canada, what does this really mean for industry in both America and Canada? Will they not both suffer from tariffs, especially when it comes to the autos?
They definitely will suffer. A very interesting statistic is that 80% of goods that Canada exports goes south of the border. So it will definitely hurt the Canadian economy. But what you're seeing in liquor stores and in grocery stores is that either the proprietor is taking down American goods so they're no longer available, or there's such a push for Canadians to buy Canadian goods that I think that there will be a willingness to suffer for a certain period of time. How long, I don't know. But you also have to remember that when it comes to some of the energy needs, the U.S. gets a ridiculous amount of its energy needs from Canada. And I think that the U.S. will suffer and Canada will suffer. And I also think that at a certain point, this is where someone like Mark Carney will be able to come in and say, we need to cut a deal. And I think that Trump would also recognize that he needs to cut a deal. And I do think cooler heads would prevail, but I'm hopeful that it's not going to get to that point.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. That is journalist Michael Jabri-Pickett. Once again, thank you very much for joining me on set. And a reminder of our top stories. Ukraine peace talks take place in Riyadh between the US and Russia. Thousands of protesters are arrested on the streets of Turkey as Istanbul's mayor faces corruption charges. Israeli strikes target a hospital, killing a senior Hamas leader. And Canada goes to the polls. Newly elected Prime Minister Mark Carney calls a snap election just 9 days in the job. And that's all from us on W News. Thank you so much for joining us. Counterpoints with Melinda Nucifora is coming up next. And don't miss Tom Burges Watson with GNT. Good night and thank you for joining me.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
By now, Israel and Hamas should have moved to phase 2 of their ceasefire deal. Instead, Palestinians are burying their dead. But did Israel ever want peace in Gaza? And far from the front lines on American university campuses, is there another battle brewing over the right to free speech and the right to protest? It's all up for debate on Counterpoints with me, Melinda Nucifora. When an Israeli airstrike shattered the fragile Gaza ceasefire, it also blew up the notion for some that the Netanyahu government was ever interested in a lasting peace, especially with threats like this from the defence minister.
Take the advice of the US president. Return the hostages and get rid of Hamas, and we will open new opportunities, including leaving to other places in the world for whoever wants it. The alternative is complete destruction and devastation.
That makes it sound as if there hasn't been utter destruction and devastation up until this point. So if the situation is set to get even worse, when does the international community step in to hold either or both sides accountable? Or has this conflict signalled the end of the rules-based order? It's perhaps no surprise then that the return to fighting in Gaza has seen the return to protesting in the US. President Donald Trump has promised to crack down on pro-Palestinian protests, blurring the lines between free speech and hate speech.
To the weaponization of Judaism to be used as some sort of excuse to crack down on civil liberties, and in particular on our Palestinian and Arab brothers and sisters. This is intolerable to me.
So important to say that America's a, constitutional liberal democracy where we're allowed to speak and not be retaliated against for what we believe in.
So I don't want anti-Semitism to be weaponized to promote these draconian rules.
Sorry for speaking.
Today on Counterpoints, our panel will debate if Israel ever wanted a lasting peace, whether this conflict has signalled the end of the rules-based order, and if there is any justification for US campus clampdowns. Stay with us on Counterpoints. We are at a crucial moment in the Israel-Hamas conflict. To discuss all the recent developments, I'm joined by the Palestinian Kuwaiti journalist and analyst Ahmed Eldin and Alan Dershowitz, the Emeritus Professor of Law at the Harvard University and author of The Case for Israel. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us here on Counterpoints. It took such a long time to reach this ceasefire, and now it feels like we are further away from it than ever before. Both sides have accused each other of stalling tactics and not negotiating in good faith. So let me ask you, who do you think is responsible for the breakdown of the current ceasefire? Professor Dershowitz, let's start with you.
Well, we have to go back a little to 2005 when the Prime Minister of Israel ended the occupation of Gaza and tried to set up a two-state solution, beginning with Gaza, giving the Gazans complete independence. They could have become Singapore on the Mediterranean. They could have had a completely independent state. Instead, there was a coup. Hamas took over, sent thousands of rockets into Israel, and then on October 7th, started a genocidal war in which they killed 1,200 innocent people, many of them peace advocates, and captured and kidnapped 250 of them. If there is to be an end to this conflict, it has to come from first a return of the hostages. They are being unlawfully held under international law. They're being brutally treated. And if they are returned, there will be a ceasefire. So the failure to return and the idea that giving one American back with 4 or 5 dead bodies somehow is enough to justify ending Israel's self-defense tactics simply is never going to do it. So it's all in Hamas's responsibility, and it's in Hamas's court. And if they were to today to announce on the show or anywhere else that they are going to return a significant number of hostages, there would be a ceasefire. And then maybe we could move toward a permanent ceasefire and ultimately toward a two-state solution.
Ahmed?
Well, I think the facts are what we should look at first. I mean, over 900 violations of the ceasefire means that there was actually never a ceasefire. It was just a tactical timeout to reload for Israel. I mean, the only difference between the last few weeks and today is the intensity being accelerated with which Israel is systematically murdering a population that is 50% or more children. Look, facts are important, and I hope, despite knowing me and Alan are going to disagree, we can stick to the facts. And some of the facts are that, you know, Alan, you spend decades branding yourself as a civil libertarian, a champion of free speech. But when it comes to Palestine, you don't defend liberty or freedom. You defend occupation, apartheid, and genocide. And, you know, you do it with the same tired playbook that the Israeli government does. You misrepresent international law. You dismiss Palestinian suffering as propaganda, and you gaslight the world into believing that Israel, the nuclear armed occupier, is the victim here. I mean, let's be clear about the facts. Israel is not defending itself. It is enforcing a system of ethnic domination and ethnic cleansing. And it's not my opinion. You know, this is a fact under international law. Consider this. You know, it's Friday today. In just a few days since Tuesday, Israel has killed at least 600 Palestinians and injured more than 900. It's massacred more than 200 children, according to UNICEF. 40% of the 600 plus Palestinians that Israel's killed in just the last 72 hours are reported to be under 14. In hospitals, there's no anesthesia. 7 children have had their legs amputated while fully awake. I mean,
let me ask you this, though, Ahmed. Before I turn this back over to Professor Dershowitz, I want to ask, you say that this was just a stalling tactic so Israel could regather itself and rearm, but there has been an argument that Hamas has used this for the exact same purposes and that they have been rearming, and there are reports that they've recruited about 1,000 new fighters during this ceasefire. So couldn't you argue also that they haven't been adhering to really upholding the ceasefire themselves?
If you think that that's an argument that they're not upholding the ceasefire, then maybe we're not clear on what the ceasefire is. Of course, they're recruiting new people. I would imagine any people who are being, bombarded with massive airstrikes, starvation, complete siege would recruit people to resist and try to survive. And quite frankly, you know, I understand why you're positing the question as such. But let's be clear about one thing. Western media has parroted the myth of a fragile truce, while Israel has been bombarding hospitals, refugee camps, and even designated safe zones. So when, you know, it's maddening to me. I mean, when a ceasefire was agreed upon to end the suffering, it was supposed to be a three-phase deal that promised a halt to the bloodshed, hostage exchanges, and negotiations for peace. Netanyahu chose power over human life. He chose power over the hostages, as he has, which is why more than 200 of the top businessmen in Israel are challenging him and his complete you know, kind of dismissal and disregard in a so-called democracy of the High Court's decision when he got rid of the Shin Bet intelligence leader. Look, Netanyahu has been stalling. The Israeli ministers have said, including those in his coalition, that there cannot be a ceasefire, that the ceasefire must be violated. I've told you that they violated it 900 times. They've been carpet bombing. I mean, this was never...
All right, well, let's turn it over to the professor now. All right, Professor, what do you think? 900 violations, was this just a tactical timeout for Israel to regroup, and were they always going to relaunch this attack?
The last thing Israel needed was a timeout. It was winning every aspect of the war. It was winning the war against the Houthis, winning the war against Hezbollah, winning the war against Hamas. If it had just continued, it could have wiped out Hamas, and then we could have a two-state solution. I want to focus on children. This is the big lie. Remember that Hamas recruits children to become combatants at the age of 13.
That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a lie, that children have been caught up in the recent bombings.
No, there's a question. Children are combatants, children with rifles, children with rockets.
I'm sorry, Alan, are you trying to justify the murder of hundreds of children by suggesting that Hamas actually recruits them into being fighters? So the toddlers who are 2 years old are fighters?
I'm not talking toddlers. Let me finish your interruption.
Let's talk about the toddlers in the thousands that have been killed by Israel, because you're doing the very same thing that I announced at the top of the program that you would do, which is...
All right. Let's let Professor Dershowitz finish his comment, and then we'll come back to you, Ahmed.
Sure. I'm not talking about the 2-year-olds or the 5-year-olds or the 10-year-olds or even the 12-year-olds. I'm talking about the 19-year-olds who were counted as children, the 18-year-olds who were counted as children, the mass murderers who were counted as children. Remember, among the people who crossed the border and raped and beheaded and burnt alive Israelis were 15-yearolds and 16-year-olds.
I'm sorry, Melinda, but if you're going to allow him to propagate and peddle disinformation that's been debunked, then that's on you.
Sorry. I'm not going to continue this if you continue to interrupt. So when you kill a 15-year-old...
If you're going to say things that are factually incorrect, isn't it my job as your opponent to challenge you on your lies and propaganda?
You'll have to dispute it. When you kill a 15-year-old who is in the process of raping a woman or in the process of killing somebody, that's a good thing. The fact that he was 15 is the fault of Hamas, not the fault of Israel. And what about the 2- and 3-year-olds? They're being used as human shields. Hamas fighters are fighting in areas where they know there are 2-year-olds. Look at Sinwar. He is now surrounding himself with children and babies and hostages because he's a coward. He's afraid to come out and fight. And so all the deaths that are being caused, and they're being misreported, obviously, the ratio of civilian to combatant deaths is lower than in any war in modern history. The ratio is approximately 1-to-1 if you don't count combatants, women who are combatants. They can be women and combatants at the same time, 17-year-olds who are combatants. The ratio is approximately 1-to-1. The average ratio fighting wars like this is 7-to-1. That is 7 civilians killed for every combatant. That was true when Afghanistan, that was true in Iraq, that was true with NATO, that was true with Britain, that was true with the United States. Israel has the absolute best ratio of killing the fewest number of civilians. But again, none of this would have happened had we not had October 7th. Are you willing now to tell me and say that October 7th began the war, October 7th was a terrorist attack, October 7th was a violation of international law, and if not for October 7th, there would be peace between Israel and Hamas? Are you prepared to say that?
All right, Ahmed, respond to that before we move on.
Let's first of all stop pretending that Alan is doing anything other than making up lies and can't back them up with facts. Second of all, you're talking to me. Let me finish. You're talking to me about October 7th. It's March 21st. You're talking to me about October 7th because you don't want to talk about every single day since October 7th and before October 7th. So as I said, let's stop pretending that this is a war. It's an enforcement of an occupation, a military onslaught against a people with no army, no air force, and no means of escape. So to Melinda's earlier question, I would just like to point out, you're saying Hamas is this assertion that Hamas is somehow rearming. There's no food, water, or medicine being allowed into the Gaza Strip. Israel controls all the borders. If we're going to have a discussion, Alan, as a professor, I would hope, although I know better, than to expect you to argue the facts. Israel, like yourself, continues to claim that this is all being done in self-defense, that tens of thousands of children are being murdered in self-defense, as if a nuclear-armed state backed by the most powerful military in the world needs to defend itself against starving, displaced civilians and children that you're claiming are human shields. Alan, I know you're going to say Israel is targeting Hamas, but tell me, did Hamas hide inside the 450 Palestinian that Israel slaughtered in just a few hours, a few days ago? You want to talk about October 7th, but you don't want to talk about that because you cannot justify the 179 children and 89 erased erased on the 17th night of the holy month of Ramadan.
Don't be sexist. Women are terrorists. They have guns. They have rockets. 19-year-olds are terrorists. So stop using children, stop using women, and start using the actual term.
This argument is so tired. Okay, Israel.
Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this discussion now onto who mediated this ceasefire or how we got here with the backing of the United States and whether or not they are an impartial mediator. Before we get into that discussion, I want you both to take a listen to Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary who spoke to reporters recently outside the White House. Have a listen to her comments here before we come back to the discussion.
Well, the president made it very clear to Hamas that if they did not release all of the hostages, there would be all hell to pay. And unfortunately, Hamas chose to play games in the media with lives. This situation, let's not forget, is completely the fault of Hamas when they launched that brutal attack on Israel on October 7th. And the president has made it very clear that he wants all of those hostages to come home, and he fully supports Israel and the IDF and the actions that they've taken in recent days.
Professor Dershowitz, is it counterintuitive for America to be pushing for a deal, to say it wants peace, while it is arming one side and purporting for the total destruction of the other?
Not at all. Israel is a democracy that is fighting self-defense. America is on its side. America is not neutral. America completely supports Israel and completely opposes Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist group. It's illegal in the United States. Providing material support for Hamas is a crime. You know, that's like saying a country should be neutral in the Second World War toward Hitler. No, Hamas is the Nazis. Hamas is Hitler. Sinwar is Hitler. These are people, look at the Hamas charter. The Hamas charter is the same as the Nazi charter. They want to kill every single Jew who lives anywhere in the Middle East. Look,
but not every person in Gaza is Hamas. Not everyone supports Hamas.
Say it again?
Not everyone in Gaza is Hamas. There are people who are being caught up in this who aren't part of Hamas.
Of course, and there are people in Israel who aren't supporters of Netanyahu. In a war, people get killed on both sides. Hamas started the war. There's no doubt about that. I have not heard Ahmed admit yet that on October 7th, Hamas started the war. By starting the war, they exposed their civilians just the way when the Nazis started the war in 1939, they knew there'd be tens of millions of German civilians killed. That's what happens in war. If you don't want civilians to be killed, you don't do two things. You don't start a war and you don't put your civilians as human shields. If you use your civilians as human shields, and by the way, Sinwar said that in his dying declaration, just before he died, he praised the martyrs who were human shields. We have tape recordings of Hamas leaders praising human shields. We are all martyrs. Sinwar said he wants civilians to be killed. Every time Israel kills a civilian, that helps Hamas. So let's put the responsibility where it is, squarely with Hamas.
Ahmed, what do you think? Ahmed, do you think that there could have been a ceasefire without the United States?
I think the United States is as complicit and guilty of... Are you going to just speak over me? Are you going to just not let me speak? Is that what's happening? Thank you. I think the U.S. is guilty of ethnic cleansing and genocide as Israel is, because they've been backing Israel, not just since October 7th, but for decades. And they've been backing a systematic campaign to ethnically cleanse the native population. Now, Alan is saying the same thing over and over because he can't say anything else, because he can't argue the facts. But he does like to talk about free speech. And you did ask about the U.S. and its role. Alan, can I just speak? Are you afraid of my truth?
I do, though, Ahmed, want you to answer the question I posed to you.
I will answer the question. I will answer. Which was the question about the U.S. and whether is that
tell
really
me whether
question?
Do you think the U.S. could this ceasefire have been reached without the U.S., even though perhaps they're not a neutral negotiator?
They're certainly not a neutral negotiator. I think all three of us and like my 5-year-old niece could agree on that. But Alan, you know, I don't think that they could have, to answer your question, because the U.S. is integral to this entire genocide. And Alan, like I was saying, you know, let's talk about what's happening in America and why perhaps the U.S. is unable to be a fair broker for peace. I mean, how do you explain a nation so eager to gut its own freedoms, as we've seen them do in the recent, weeks, on behalf of a foreign state whose leaders have not only an international arrest warrant out for their war crimes, including starvation by the ICC, but how do we explain Columbia University, my alma mater, where I also was an adjunct professor for several years, turning students over to ICE to deport them without charge, without charging them with a crime? I mean, Mahmoud Khalil, a Palestinian, can I finish? Mahmoud Khalil, a Palestinian doctoral student, arrested in broad daylight in front of his 8-month pregnant wife by unnamed agents wearing Avengers shirts. I mean, it's insane to me that we're sitting here having a debate about America perhaps not being a fair broker. I mean, Jewish students protesting genocide, Alan, are being expelled for protesting against genocide and ethnic cleansing, which, as you know, millions of Jews were the victims of during the Holocaust. Grant Minor, the Jewish Columbia student and president of the Student Workers of Columbia United Auto Workers, was expelled by the university for protesting. Meanwhile, those who speak out are being silenced, like a French researcher just a few days ago being
We are
detained
going to come to free speech really shortly. I want to move this on. You were mentioning free speech there, Ahmed. We are going to come to that really shortly. But I want to move our discussion on to accountability. Because under international law, warring parties are expected to adhere to rules of distinction to minimise civilian casualties, as you've both been discussing already, but also proportionality. However, the ceasefire-ending strike from Israel a few days ago killed more than 500 Palestinians. Yes, Hamas says that they were targeting terrorists, but as we have been discussing, almost half of those were children. Now, the ICC has issued arrest warrants for both Israeli and Hamas leaders, but often those warrants are never acted on. So, Ahmed, I want to ask you, if we look at this more broadly, has this conflict forever upended this notion that the West is adhering to the international rules-based order?
Yes, I do think that it has. And it's evident in how Alan and other apologists are perfecting the art of reframing facts and doing it in order to disregard the rule of law, which we're all supposed to abide by. I mean, when a hospital is bombed, it's called a strike on Hamas infrastructure. When tens of thousands of Palestinians are buried in rubble, it's dismissed as collateral damage. Israel tells civilians to evacuate safe zones only to bomb them next. I mean, this is a systematic campaign that is manufacturing consent for genocide. And, we're also seeing the genocide, the ethnic cleansing, Israel's collective punishment of the Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, making it seem as if this is a conflict, right? This is two equal sides fighting that are rearming, that are, rather than an occupying force
never always
systematically
equal. They don't
erasing the
have to be equal for it to be a conflict. International wars are never always equal. Unfortunately.
Fair enough, but why is this? I hear you, but why is this not ever the situation when we talk about Russia in the media? I mean, Israel's genocide against Palestinians.
I would argue that there is a discussion about that in some parts of the media.
I would argue that it's not the same discussion and not to the same extent. I mean, collective punishment, when Russia does it, it's a war crime. The media says it, undeniably. All European governments say it. When Israel does it with more intensity, in more violation, for decades, not only is it funded and defended, I mean, the International Court of Justice explicitly warned against what Israel is doing, and Israel's doing it anyway. No consequences, no sanctions, no arms embargo. That doesn't happen when Russia annexes or attacks, innocent civilians in Ukraine, right?
Okay, I think Professor Dershowitz wants to intervene. What do you think? This plays right into your field of expertise. International law here. How can Israel stand in front of the world and say that they are not breaching any international rules of engagement?
They are not. They're completely in compliance. They are a compliant country. In the history of warfare, they always use the concept of proportionality, but they are being attacked. Remember, they are being attacked asymmetrically by a group that admits it doesn't accept the rules of law. Recently, Hamas has targeted Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. They haven't even tried to excuse it. They are trying to kill as many civilians as possible. The goal of Hamas has always been to kill civilians. They make no effort at distinction or at proportionality. As many civilians as they can kill, they kill. They also want Palestinian civilians to die. That's part of their philosophy. The more Palestinian civilians are dead, and the more you can call them children and women, the more somebody like Ahmed could get on television and try to blame it all on Israel. Israel doesn't benefit when it kills a civilian.
Professor, I want to ask you, though, you say that they are upstanding international citizens, but there were very credible reports that suggest that Israel loosened their rules of engagement at the start of the Gaza war to allow attacks despite heightened risks of civilian targets. So how can you excuse that?
That's exactly right. Countries change their rules of engagement all the time. Proportionality requires context. And when you're fighting an enemy that uses children and uses human shields, of course you have to change your rules, but the rules are still consistent with proportionality. There is no country in the world...
Oh, I'm sorry, you have to change the rules to somehow justify and enable you to kill children and find a way to justify it. Of course, that's, as a professor of international law, you're saying that this happens all the time. Forget the treaties that we've signed, forget Israel's own constitution. And I mean, it's laughable, sadly, if it wasn't so obscene to hear you say this, Professor.
You're not going to let me finish.
We'll let the professor finish.
Israel has gone to more effort. Israel has risked more of its soldiers than any country in the history of modern warfare to reduce the number of civilian deaths on the other side, and for a very obvious selfish reason. Every time a civilian dies, every time a child dies, every time a woman dies, Israel is hurt. And every time that happens, Hamas is helped. That's why Hamas wants civilians to die. They want Jewish civilians to die. They want Muslim civilians to die. They want Christian civilians to die. That's part of their policy. That's part of their game plan. Israel has exactly the opposite goal. It wants to reduce the number of civilians. It gains nothing from killing civilians. And if Hamas...
Can I ask a quick question, if you don't mind? Can I ask a quick question?
Let me finish. If Hamas would stop using human shields, they would return the hostages.
You're just repeating yourself. How can we let you finish?
All right. Let me turn it over to you, though, Ahmed, because I want to ask, do you accept, though, that if we're talking about proportionality here, Hamas has to bear some responsibility for the current devastation and the current situation in Gaza?
Sure, but that's not what Alan is saying.
But that's what I'm asking you. So tell me what you think about that.
I said, sure, I do think they have some responsibility, but I'm saying that, and I just want to clarify for your viewers, that Alan said Israel has no responsibility, right? And I just think that says a lot in of itself. Alan, I don't know if you're going to answer this, but after I finish my points, I'd love to know, why then are Israeli leaders saying there's no such thing as a civilian if Israel is trying very hard? I mean, it's kind of conflicting, right? For so many Israeli leaders to come out and say that everybody in Gaza is a target. There's no such thing as, you're interrupting me. I'm
civilian. Why? Of course there's civilians. Everybody knows there's civilians. It's a lie.
So then why are the Israeli leaders saying this? Kind of, what is this language? It doesn't prove genocide. You don't think that this proves genocidal intent? And that's the reason that the ICJ, hold on, that's the reason that the ICJ found that Israel is plausibly committing genocide? Alan, you are one of the architects of this framing, as we've witnessed on this program. You twist language the same way Israel twists facts, because without propaganda, this kind of brutality could never be justified. Even if, as Melinda asked me, Hamas has a burden to pay or some responsibility. And Alan, I know that somewhere in that hollow body of yours, you know that what I'm saying is true, because you love to talk about international law when it serves you. So tell me, when does international law allow starving an entire population? When does it allow bombing hospitals? Does international law say if the Hamas boogeyman...
All right, okay, I want to turn it over. I want the professor to be able to answer your question there, Ahmed. I want the professor to be able to answer that. So, Professor, under international law, do you think that Israel has upheld its part of the bargain, letting in humanitarian aid? It's been criticised across the board for that. How can they justify it?
And criticism is wrong. Israel has allowed more humanitarian aid than the United States ever allowed into Germany, than any country has ever allowed.
But we're not talking about the World War II. A lot has happened in the world since World War II.
Who has heard of an enemy providing oil and gas so that the enemy can use it for its rockets? Of course, Israel has to make sure that the material that's going to the Gaza is not being used by Hamas as weapons. And Israel has opened up the corridors. It only closed the corridors after Hamas refused to release the hostages that it did pursuant to a deal. Let me talk about the International Criminal Court. It is a fake court. It is a UN court. Its members are picked by their countries. They have to do the biting of their... The Chinese judge will be executed if he doesn't follow the Chinese government. The International Criminal Justice is not a real court. It's a fake court. Nobody should listen to it. International law is important as long as it's administered fairly. But when you have courts condemning Israel more than all the other countries of the world combined, including in the Sudan.
Perhaps that's because Israel's committing systemic violations that violate the international law in a way that no other country has.
There's a new concept. It's called Palestinianism. I have a book about it. And it believes that the only group in the world that deserves support are Palestinians, and the only group in the world that deserves condemnation is Israel. And what's happened is Palestinianism is destroying human rights and turning human rights into only Palestinian rights, ignoring the rights of the people in Darfur who are actually starving, the people in other parts of the world who are actually starving. The Palestinians have caused their own problems. They could have had a state.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, they caused their own problems.
Respond to that before we move on. Respond to that for us, Ahmed.
Honestly, it just sounds like I'm speaking to like a child. I don't know. He's still speaking. I hear him in the background yelling like a crazy person. And honestly, I hate to make it like I'm attacking you personally, but I'm quite appalled at your level of not being informed on basic international law. Melinda, as you know, assassinating and targeting journalists and their families is a war crime.
Are you in favor of a two-state solution?
Are you still speaking? Are you not going to let me speak? I don't want to talk. We're not talking about the two-state solution. We're talking about you actively finding very bizarre ways to justify genocide. Look, Melinda, we hear about Israel's right to defend itself. And for your audience, it's important for me. Are you going to keep interrupting me?
We're going to come back to you in a moment, Professor. Let's let Ahmed finish, and then we're going to come back to you because we're going to move on really shortly. Ahmed, wrap this up for us.
I'll wrap it up for you. We hear it over and over. Israel has the right to defend itself. Alan just said it. But let's be clear. Israel is not invoking self-defense against another sovereign state. It is invoking self-defense against the very people it occupies. Now, I know Alan very conveniently wants to blame everything on Hamas and the Palestinians themselves and Palestinianism. He sounds like a child. What you call self-defense amounts to the bombing of neighborhoods, the destruction of entire communities, and the systematic starvation of more than 2 million people. And under international law, an occupier, as you know, Alan, has no right to claim self-defense against the people it occupies. So why then are the audience asking, can I just finish? Why then is the burden of proof always, as Alan is putting it, on the oppressed? Never the oppressor. When Hamas fires rockets, Israel and its allies call it terrorism. But when Israel flattens entire neighborhoods or sends pagers to Lebanon, which the former CIA director admitted very openly is a mass terror attack, it's called collateral damage. I mean, Alan, you've spent your career twisting legal arguments to justify Israel's brutality, and I get that. But tell me, if a foreign army invaded your home, demolished your neighborhoods, and executed your family, would you agree that such actions were self-defense?
Okay, let's let Professor Dershowitz respond before we move on. Right of reply to you, Professor.
Hamas invaded a peaceful area, a peaceful music festival, and murdered and raped everybody. Yes, I think that is aggression and attempted genocide. And
Melinda,
yes,
you're aware
he
didn't
just let the professor finish. Thanks, Ahmed.
Well, he didn't answer my question.
Israel is fighting a nation. The nation Israel is fighting is called Iran. Iran has armed Hamas. Iran has armed the Houthis. Iran has armed Hezbollah. And Israel is fighting against a four-pronged attack to destroy its very existence. Remember, Hamas's charter demands that Israel not exist. I have favored a two-state solution since 1967. I continue to favor a two-state solution. I would like Ahmed to answer my question directly. Do you support a two-state solution in which there is a Palestinian state living in peace next to a Jewish state called the nation-state of Israel? Do you support that? Answer.
Alan, I'm not a monkey that you can make answer when you're not engaging me. No. Why would I answer him if he didn't answer me? He started talking about Hamas. And by the way, my name is Ahmed.
Okay. Let's not descend into
I'm not
that discussion. Unless you're going to answer Professor's comment, I'm going to move on.
Okay, I'll answer the question. I support truth and facts, and I support Palestinians living in freedom and liberation from the river to the sea, just like Jewish citizens of this state, whatever you want to interpret that as. But I do want to say, we haven't talked about, Alan, the fact that you built your entire, I'm sorry?
Israel.
I'm sorry?
You believe there should not be a country called Israel because you say...
No, that's what you're saying. I said what I said. I know what you're trying to do because you're the kind of guy... Look, Alan, let's be honest.
Okay, I'm going to move this on because we still have...
Why is he allowed to say that and then I can't defend myself?
Okay, but make it snappy.
Okay, you defend individuals like Jeffrey Epstein, justify the targeting of killing civilians and children. And you're arguing that torture is sometimes necessary. Now you stand before us and you defend the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. At what point, Alan, do you stop asking questions of me that don't make sense? And do you start asking yourself and admitting that your legal arguments are nothing more than a cover for genocide?
Okay, all right, I'm going to move it on. Gentlemen, you were discussing a little bit earlier, Ahmed, about student protests about Columbia University. So the debate around free speech has heated up again in the US following the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil, a demonstration leader at New York's Columbia University. He was arrested and campus protesters have been accused of anti-Semitism, but they argue that they're rallying against the Israeli government's actions and not against all Jewish people. So, Professor Dershowitz, let me ask you first. Are these clampdowns on protesters justified in any way if they're protesting and we talk about the amendment of free speech?
I'm completely in favor of protests. I'm completely in favor of free speech. I defended Palestinians in the Harvard campus and their right to put up a Palestinian flag. I defend Khalil's right to write a letter from prison in which he expresses his free speech. That letter has gotten more attention than all of his previous statements together. What they don't support is people getting into the country fraudulently. And there's every reason to believe that Khalil, when he made his visa application, denied that he supports terrorism or terrorist groups. If he, in fact, was supporting Hamas and was supporting October 7th, then he committed fraud in getting his visa and his green card. That doesn't mean he doesn't have free speech rights. He can speak from outside the country. He can do Zooms. Nobody is suppressing anybody's right of free speech. I want as much free speech as possible, but people should not be allowed to come into the country. Being admitted to the United States is not a right. It's a privilege if they are using it to prevent other people's free speech. Remember, Khalil's group prevented Jewish students from going to class. They disrupted a professor who was trying to teach about the Middle East. They occupied buildings. They attacked janitors. Those are not protected free speech. So I'm completely in favor of protecting the free speech both of Jewish students and of protesters who don't believe that Jewish students should have free speech. But I don't believe in the right to occupy buildings. I don't believe in the right to take over classrooms. I don't believe in the right to intimidate or harass Jewish students. And that's what Khalil is accused of doing. And so there'll be a trial. There'll be a hearing. We'll find out whether he got his...
That's actually correct. That's not what he was accused.
All right, Ahmed, what's your take? Is this free speech or is this a crackdown?
Say it again.
I think it's again, it says a lot. It says a lot that, you know, Alan can't even admit that America is undergoing a very deliberate and overt attack on free speech and the Constitution. A French researcher was detained upon arrival in the US. His phone and laptop were confiscated, his private messages scrutinized by federal agents, and his only crime was criticizing Trump's cuts to scientific research. You know, I know that's not about Mahmoud Khalil and the demonization that you were trying to draw up there, but DHS agents have actually labeled his words as hatred of Trump. That could be described as terrorism. So, you know, he was deported the next day. But Alan, as you know, Alan, let me finish. Alan, as you know, not everyone, Alan, let me finish. Not everyone gets treated like this. For example, as a former professor at Columbia myself, Shai Davide, an Israeli professor who has spent 2 years. Can I just finish?
Yeah.
I spent 2 years harassing colleagues, spewing all kinds of propaganda, calling for the death of Arabs, and protesting so aggressively that even Columbia suspended him. But has he been deported? Has he been arrested? Has he been branded a national security threat? Why is this? Well, Melinda, it's very simple. Because in today's America, free speech in America only applies when your words serve power. And that's a hypocrisy that Alan is defending when it's convenient, and we ignore it when it exposes Israel's oppression, occupation, and collective punishment.
I want to ask you actually then, Professor, let me turn that to you. There is a difference between the Jewish people as a community and the Israeli government. So is it a tactic to conflate the two for political reasons?
No, it's not. When you single out only the one nation state of the Jewish people, Israel, for unique condemnation, when you ignore Sudan, when you ignore what's going on in the rest of the world, when you only protest the nation state of the Jewish people and apply a double standard to it, that's anti-Semitism. There are Jewish anti-Semites, just like there are Arab anti-Muslims. That's true of every single culture. But the idea that you apply a double standard to the one nation state in the world, that is the Jewish state, obviously is a form of anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism has become a euphemism for anti-Semitism. And when a member of Congress says it's the Benjamins, baby, that's the only reason that there's support for Israel, that's anti-Semitism.
So do you think that there's no way people can criticize the actions of the Israeli government without being anti-Semitic?
All the time.
Let me ask you again, Professor, do you think there's any way that people can criticize the actions of Benjamin Netanyahu's government and criticize the actions of what the government is doing and not be anti-Semitic?
Absolutely. The vast majority of Israelis who read Haaretz and who read the Jewish Daily Forward are critical of the Israeli government. If you're Jewish, you can be critical of the Israeli government. If you're an Arab or a Muslim and you're critical of Hamas, you'll be executed. You'll be murdered.
So why then are Jewish students being expelled? And
off a roof if you're a member of Hamas. So let's understand the double standard that we're hearing. It's okay for Hamas to do all the things it does: anti-gay, anti-trans, anti-women, anti-Semitic, anti-everything. That's okay because somehow they're oppressed. But what Israel does is subject to super criticism. I just want a single standard of criticism. And I'm perfectly happy to criticize the Netanyahu government as I have. I don't think the head of Shin Bet should have been fired, but that's not your business. That's not my business. Israel's a democracy, unlike Hamas. Unlike any Arab state in the world, Israel is a democracy, and people have free speech rights to criticize it, whether you're Jewish or not. And I will continue to criticize the Israeli government, to criticize Hamas, and I will apply a single standard of criticism, no matter what the ethnic background is.
Ahmed?
I mean, to suggest that Israel is a democracy, again, just ignores the basic facts. It's a supremacist state where Jews enjoy a completely different legal system, and I don't want to get bogged down in talking.
Let's not.
I'm sorry?
Let's not get bogged down in that. That's a conversation for another day.
Let's not. Yeah. But what I will say is, if you don't want to believe me, I mean, you say, that your question was very well framed, and I think it highlights something very troubling. We've heard from Israeli genocide scholar, of course, who have criticized the Israeli government for waging this genocide. His name is Raz Segal. He says how, the weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism, the real struggle, actually puts Jewish people at risk. And so, this conflation, as you said, of a people and a state, it's really troubling. And, we're here saying we're willing to criticize the Israeli government. Alan, you keep saying this war is about Hamas and hostages, and that Israel is fighting to bring them home. But I want to ask you, Netanyahu accepted the ceasefire deal, and why would he then not prioritize the hostages' release, as the families have been demanding just a few days ago, marching to the border with Gaza? He hasn't, because if he has, he wouldn't be carpet bombing Gaza. He escalated the bombing, risking even the lives of his own citizens, and his war cabinet, as you must know, I hope, is fracturing. His approval ratings are plummeting, and his only recourse is endless bloodshed. I mean, Netanyahu's actions by rejecting the ceasefire deal and stalling the hostage negotiations, as well as intensifying the military assault, are clearly not designed to secure safety for any people, let alone Jewish people, but to preserve.
Okay, let Professor Dershowitz respond.
I'm saying the United States government has formally announced that the end of the ceasefire was completely the fault of Hamas, that Hamas rejected the offers put forward by the United States government to release a certain number of hostages, and then the ceasefire would continue. And so the ceasefire ending is part of the effort to get the hostages back. The only way to get the hostages back is by putting pressure. In fact, it's working. Hamas announced just today that maybe it would consider, as the result of the bombing, as the result of the military attack, maybe it would consider releasing the hostages. If Hamas released all the hostages today, there'd be an end of this war. That's it. So it's all under the control of Hamas. Release the hostages.
So let me ask this, though. A senior Hamas official, Dr. Bassem Naim, yesterday said that the negotiators were on a verge of a breakthrough on that final negotiation before Prime Minister Netanyahu launched these strikes which broke the ceasefire. So was there ever negotiation in good faith?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you're saying.
I'll repeat my question to you. Just yesterday, Dr. Bassem Naim, a senior Hamas official, said that negotiators were on the verge of a breakthrough in the negotiations before Prime Minister Netanyahu launched the ceasefire ending strikes earlier in the week. So were there negotiations in good faith?
Well, you know, first of all, the United States government has said it's all Hamas's fault, and it's very simple. Let Hamas release the hostages, and we'll see it.
Over and over. Wow.
There will be a ceasefire if Hamas releases the hostages. The only reason for the continuing fighting is to rescue the hostages, these people who are illegally being detained in violation of all international law. You know, you hear Ahmed always piddling about Israel maybe violating this, maybe violating that. But he
what are the families of the hostages doing? Are they piddling as well?
Aspect of international law from the very beginning. So does he have any standing as a Hamas speaker, a Hamas representative, somebody who's opposed to the two-state solution? Does he have any standing even to criticize Israel?
Speaker? Is that what I am, Melinda? So he's allowed to say these things about me, right? I'm a Hamas speaker.
Okay, all right. Let's give Ahmed a right of reply there. He obviously has the right to defend himself.
I'm not interested in defending myself because I don't take anything he says to heart because it's all lies. What I'm interested in is defending the right of the Palestinian people to live in justice and dignity. And you would think that that wouldn't be so triggering to Alan or anyone who actually wants peace. Alan, I'm going to say this directly to you, although I know you're going to interrupt me. No matter how much legal jargon and threats and trying to associate me with Hamas and worse than Hamas you throw around, you are failing at sanitizing this. And the fact that you are here still trying to justify this and blame Hamas entirely, not just for the ceasefire falling through, but for their own ethnic cleansing, is why your own credibility is collapsing. For decades, Israel, like yourself, has been weaponizing language, and the world is waking up. Palestinians are no longer just statistics. They are teachers, doctors, children, human beings being exterminated in front of our eyes, and no amount of propaganda or interruptions can cover that up anymore. This isn't about Hamas. Hamas has only been around for 20 years, 20 odd years. If it were, as you say, about the hostages, Netanyahu would have taken the deal. But his power depends on war, which is why the same day he was supposed to go testify in his corruption. Can I finish without you interrupting me? I'm almost done.
Just finish that statement, Ahmed. Professor, we're going to come to you straight after this to wrap it up. Ahmed, finish off very briefly. We're running out of time.
I just wonder how many more journalists like myself and you need to be killed by the Israeli government before people like Alan and others can actually admit that Israel is flagrantly committing war crimes and is not being held accountable precisely because of what we've agreed on this conversation, which is the US is backing those war crimes.
Okay, Professor, right of reply to you before we end, and we are almost out of time.
Israel wants to live in peace and is perfectly happy to live in peace alongside Palestinians who live in peace. If Israel weren't the subject of what happened on October 7th, there would have been no war in Gaza. If Israel hadn't been attacked when it was first created in 1948, the Palestinians would have a wonderful, very large state. 100% of the fault for the Middle East crisis lies with the Palestinian leadership, with the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem who refused to accept Israel, with Hamas, which refuses to accept Israel. If Hamas will simply return the hostages, lay down their arms, there will be peace. If Israel were to lay down its arms, there would be genocide. It's as simple as that. This is a one-sided issue. Israel wants peace. It wants to live alone. It wants to live in peace. The Palestinians want to see the end of Israel. Zionism is about building a state, Israel. Palestinianism and Hamas is about destroying the state. And that's why my distinguished opponent took...
Gentlemen, we could go on this ad infinitum, but I'm going to have to wrap it up there. I'm going to have to leave it there. Thank you both. This has been a very lively discussion. I appreciate your time. Palestinian Kuwaiti journalist and analyst Ahmed Eldin and Professor Alan Dershowitz, the Emeritus Professor of Law at Harvard University. Thank you both for your time. And thank you for joining us here on Al Arabiya English. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any discussions like this one, and follow us on X and TikTok for all the latest content. This is Counterpoints with me, Melinda Nucifora.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deep fake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers.
My campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Rizkan Show for empowering conversation.
Sydney, Australia's largest city, is often dubbed as one of the most beautiful in the world. The place offers an attractive mix of modern architecture, historical landmarks, breathtaking views, relaxing gardens, and more. What are the top spots to see in Sydney? Perhaps Australia's most famous man-made attraction, and a worldwide icon too, is the Sydney Opera House. The structure alone is already a unique feat of architectural design and engineering. While built from innovation, creativity, and quite a bit of controversy, the Sydney Opera House remains a remarkable building that's home to over 1,500 performances a year and inviting up to 1.2 million audiences each time. One of the most well-maintained and well-preserved examples of colonial-style architecture in Australia is Sydney's Government House. Since its construction in 1846, it has been home to 27 governors and today remains one of the city's hidden gems, with interiors characteristic of its Gothic influence. Located nearby is the Royal Botanic Gardens, which offers a bevy of colors that's a sight to see in any season. It is kept alive with birds such as cockatoos and sleeping flying foxes that hang from branches, among many other natural wonders. The Australian National Maritime Museum is known for its sensational displays of the country's maritime heritage. Exhibits on display range from full-size to scale ships, an authentic submarine, and other relics of shipping history. The iconic Queen Victoria building is Sydney's ultimate shopping hub. As the building itself is an architectural marvel that boasts of fine details, craftsmanship, and style, it gives tourists an elegant and high-end shopping experience. Worth the hike is Sydney's Blue Mountains, located in New South Wales. Its blue haze horizon offers a breathtaking view and the perfect escape from the busy city. It's a great way to appreciate the scenery, wildlife, and mountain surroundings. Australia's Bondi Beach is known as the most popular in the country. It's close to the suburbs and easily accessible, which allows tourists and locals alike a spontaneous visit. Its great sand and clean waters are what make the beach a popular hotspot.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, Following Sunday's talks in Saudi Arabia between the US and Ukraine, today US and Russian officials are holding talks in the same venue aimed at paving the way for a ceasefire in Ukraine. The arrest of the Istanbul mayor and opposition leader Ekrem İmamoğlu triggers some of Turkey's worst unrest in years. More than 1,100 people are reported to have been arrested. And Gaza's health ministry says more than 50,000 Palestinians have now been killed in the Israel-Hamas war, including more than 700 killed since Israel resumed its bombardment last week. Hello and welcome to the programme. We begin in Saudi Arabia, where US negotiators have today been holding talks in the capital, Riyadh, talks aimed at paving the way towards an end to the fighting in Ukraine. Well, on Sunday, the US delegation met with Ukrainian negotiators, and today the US team has been meeting with Russian negotiators. Well, as well as bringing about an end to the war in Ukraine, Washington's aim is also to improve bilateral ties with Moscow. But despite these diplomatic efforts, thousands of kilometers away, the fighting continues, with both Ukraine and Russia accusing each other of launching overnight drone strikes. Let's get more now, and we can speak to Ambassador William B. Taylor, the US Chargé d'Affaires to Ukraine under President Trump, currently distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council, who joins us now from Michigan. Ambassador, great to have you with us. You, of course, also served under Presidents Bush and Obama. I'd like to ask you, first of all, what your assessment is of the Trump administration's efforts to end the war in Ukraine.
So, Tom, I will say that the Trump administration has put a higher priority on ending the war than the previous administration. President Trump, as we remember, has famously said he was going to solve it, he was going to resolve it in 24 hours, which, of course, no one thought that was actually possible. But that did indicate that there's a high priority, sense of urgency to this, which we didn't have before. Previously, we were providing weapons and ammunition and intelligence, but we weren't engaged in bringing the war to an end. And President Trump is. That could be a good thing. He can bring some pressure on certainly President Putin to be able to end this war.
How does he do that? How does he exert pressure on President Putin? Because some might say he'd made a few concessions to President Putin and got none in return.
Some of his people have made some concessions already. You're exactly right, and they've got nothing in return. But President Putin really does want to come in from the cold. President Putin is isolated. He's an indicted war criminal by the International Criminal Court for abducting Ukrainian children. He's got sanctions on him and his economy. His civilian economy is not going well. His civilian economy is fragile, and more sanctions or even more enforcement of existing sanctions can really do bad damage, can do severe damage to the Russian economy. So President Putin wants some things from President Trump. President Trump can use that as leverage to get from President Putin a better deal than President Putin has been talking about. President Putin has been making these outlandish requests, demands, preconditions that are just not going to go anywhere with the Ukrainians or the Europeans or the Americans. So President Trump can bring some pressure.
So you're saying that the sanctions are having the intended effect when they were enacted a couple of years ago. And this, in turn, you're saying can be used as carrots to get the Russians to agree to a deal that's perhaps closer to what the Ukrainians might want out of this. Is that roughly what you're saying?
Yes, I would say carrots or sticks, because as you indicate, the sanctions that have been on for years, and it's Europeans and Americans have these sanctions on, but they've been evaded. Those sanctions have been somewhat effective, and they have hurt the Russian economy as they were designed to do, to make it more difficult for them to be able to fund this war, this illegal war. The sanctions have done that, but they haven't stopped the war. The sanctions haven't stopped the war for a couple of reasons, but one is they haven't been fully enforced. It is possible to make these sanctions tougher, enforced more, or even additional sanctions. So that those could be the sticks. Yes, there are some carrots that if the Russians get out of Ukraine and cooperate with President Trump and President Zelensky, then there could be some sanctions relief.
Ambassador, a couple of clues emerged on the U.S. position from the White House National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. During the weekend, he gave an interview in which he said that a ceasefire in the Black Sea, a sort of a maritime ceasefire, could be one of the things that comes out of the talks in Riyadh. He also talked about the lines of control. And I'm just wondering whether you think the US would agree to a deal that saw the lines of control frozen where they are now, and whether you think Ukraine would support such a deal.
Tom, the second part of your question is the important one. Would the Ukrainians agree? They are the ones that are going to be negotiating with the Russians. Maybe, yes, through the Americans. Maybe this is a shuttle diplomacy kind of a negotiation. With the Ukrainians in one room and the Russians in another. But let's be very clear, it is really a Russia-Ukraine negotiation, the Americans in the middle. But you asked the right question. Would they be willing, or would we be willing, to see the lines frozen? I think the Ukrainians would hate it. The Americans would want to see this war end, or at least this firing, this killing stop. In some just and lasting way to get to a just and lasting peace. So it may be for some period of time that these lines, the current lines, could be the ceasefire lines. You mentioned the Black Sea, and they've also talked about, of course, energy ceasefires. Both sides would agree not to fire at each other's energy sophistication system. But then they might talk about Black Sea agreements to allow exports. And then they may get to a ceasefire in the air. And finally, a broad ceasefire, which is what President Trump and President Zelensky agreed on. And President Trump presented to President Putin, and President Putin said no. He didn't want this broad ceasefire. But that's the stage. Energy, Black Sea, air, land, and then finally a full ceasefire, which would then set the stage, Tom, for real negotiations on a settlement, a final settlement.
I just want to pick up on one of the things you were saying there, Ambassador. You were saying, would the Ukrainians accept such a deal? Do you think the Ukrainians can really just turn around and say no to a deal that's presented or brokered on its behalf by the United States? Or do you think they have to accept what Washington puts in front of them?
They don't have to accept it. They do want to be as cooperative as they can with Washington, but they've shown on a couple of occasions that they're willing to say no. You may remember a couple of weeks ago, the Treasury Secretary, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, showed up in Kyiv, Ukraine, and put a draft agreement on minerals, on U.S. Development of rare earths and strategic minerals. He put a draft of this agreement on the table. And President Zelensky basically said, no, I'm going to take a look at this and I'm going to make some suggestions and negotiate. And so they've done that, number one. Number two, they are fighting, Tom, literally for their lives, for their existence, for the existence of Ukraine as a nation. And they're not willing to compromise. They can't compromise on that. So even if the going gets tough in these negotiations, the Ukrainians will continue to fight. They've shown that they can fight for more than 3 years. They've been fighting, I keep track, 1,125 days they've been fighting, and they'll continue on.
There's a perception, and I think quite a lot of people would agree, that President Trump's pretty hard on President Zelensky, whose country you served in and whose country was invaded. The Ukrainians, after all, have played ball. They accepted the 30-day ceasefire deal, which Russia did not. Why do you think President Trump is so hard on the Ukrainian leader? Is it justified, do you think?
So you're right, it's a complicated relationship, but it seems to kind of go up and down. Right now, they seem to be on track, in sync, on the same page, the Americans and the Ukrainians. But yes, there's a history there, undoubtedly, that comes into play. However, going forward, it is very clear that the Ukrainian interest in a just and lasting peace is the same as the interest that the Americans have for a just and lasting peace. It will provide the security to Europe, and it will provide security to the United States. It will provide benefits to Ukrainians, Europeans, and Americans. So I think the interests are what's key, and they are widely shared between the Ukrainians and Americans.
Okay, and just lastly, the United States delegation and the Ukrainian delegation held some talks on Sunday. Today, it's obviously more about the US delegation talking to the Russian delegation. We understand there are going to be more talks after those talks between the US and the Ukrainian delegations again. That suggests, doesn't it, that ground has been made, progress has been made, both in the Sunday talks and the Monday talks, for there to be talks happening again. Do you think the signs are looking optimistic?
I think they're looking good. I think it's the right next step. But you're right to point out that these conversations are steps in that direction. These conversations are not senior level. These are not, heads of state or even ministerial level discussions, except that the Ukrainians do have their Minister of Defense there. But the Russian delegation and indeed the American delegation are basically experts, and they are working on the specifics of a ceasefire, starting again with the energy, and then maybe progressing to the Black Sea. But these are step by step. We're not looking for a big breakthrough, but it's a good indication that they're making progress.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Ambassador William B. Taylor, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's get more on the talks, and we can speak now to Sergei Markov, who is a former spokesperson for President Putin, who joins us now from Moscow. Mr. Markov, thank you for joining us once again here on Al Arabiya News. We're just hearing from the Russian representative, Grigory Karasin, and I gather you know him quite well. He is, of course, a seasoned Russian diplomat. He says the talks are progressing, quote, creatively. What do you think he means by that?
I know Grigory Karasin personally many years. He is extremely experienced. He was first deputy Russian foreign minister responsible for the post-Soviet countries, including Ukraine. And he knows personally also a lot of members of Ukrainian delegation. When he used a creative negotiation, he meaning that this negotiation go far beyond what expected. It's exactly what means, what usually we understand. It means that the topics for negotiation much more broader than it was expected. And also creativeness positive characteristic. It means this negotiation is going positively from a Russian point of view. Also creative means that American side can make some quite good suggestion from a Russian point of view.
You emphasized the fact that Grigory Karasin is extremely experienced. The same can be said of Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. I know he's not taking part this time around, but we're talking about a brand new administration in Washington. And on the one hand, you've got these very experienced Russians and these very inexperienced Americans. Do you think your delegations therefore got the upper hand?
I think that Donald Trump team also very experienced, but not from diplomacy point of view. It's one of the problems that Russian side is very experienced in diplomacy, but diplomacy now is a crisis, everybody understands. And Donald Trump and Witkoff, who is his Trump personal friend and also big businessman in New York, and they're very experienced in making the deal. They're very experienced in making negotiation about the deal. And as you understand, the businessman in New York, which is very big from business point of view and very competitive area. As businessmen in New York, they're very tough, very strong, very experienced in negotiation.
The Kremlin, meanwhile, Dmitry Peskov saying we're only at the beginning of the whole process. And I'm just wondering how hopeful you are that these talks in Riyadh are going to achieve some sort of a breakthrough on the battlefield in Ukraine.
Nobody knows, but I will tell you my guess. My guess is that probability of the peace deal during this spring sounds like about 25%. And but probability of the making peace deal to the end of this year already something about 65%. So this is my general impression. Now we have in the Riyadh negotiation about 3 levels of the peace. One is sectoral ceasefire, meaning stopping of attacking against energy infrastructure and possibly another kind of infrastructure. It's first level. Second level is full ceasefire, but temporary ceasefire on the 30 days. And generally, third level is general peace deal. I think negotiation is touching the question issue on all these levels. And but of course, Russia wants to make a small step first. Also because Russia side believes that Ukrainian regime and European countries will violate those agreements. So it's better to allow them to violate only small agreement instead of allowing them to violate big agreement.
Before I pick you up on that, there is another element to discussion there in Riyadh. They're talking about a Black Sea maritime ceasefire, which would be significant from the point of view of food exports from Ukraine. Do you think that's likely to be achieved?
You know, I don't want to say. I will tell you the truth. It's just a small trick of the Donald Trump team, because they understand that a temporary ceasefire general is not high probability, but to make a ceasefire on the Black Sea, it's very easily, because Ukrainian experts from Black Sea fleet, Black Sea ports already bigger than before the war had been started. So it's going very well. And also the situation in the Black Sea, it's not so intense from point of view of the fight, because only Russian army has Black Sea fleet. Ukrainian in fact has not, but Ukraine has a very strong army of the sea drones, which attacked Russian Black Sea fleet. And as a result, in the Black Sea, there are no military ships, because Russian military ships hide away in the Russian port under the protection, and Ukrainian army has no real big ships. So it's very easily to get the deal, the peace deal in the Black Sea. It could be very good from information point of view for Donald Trump team. Donald Trump can report, you know, it's great. I made the peace deal for the Black Sea, but it's not so much.
Okay, so you think that's a bit of window dressing there. Moscow, of course, joining those talks in Saudi Arabia, sitting opposite a Trump administration delegation. I just want to ask you how the dynamic has changed the last 2 months in terms of relations between Washington and Moscow now that the Biden administration's gone. How different is it working with this new administration?
Of course, the great difference of this administration compared with previous administration. Previous administration of Joe Biden, in fact, was initiator of this war and main engine of those war. And this Donald Trump administration want to make the peace deal. It's very important. Also, it's very important that you touch that it's not only Ukrainian crisis between Russia and United States. Donald Trump wants to solve another issues. First of all, Donald Trump and his team wants to make the order of the Ukraine of American people, who demand, first of all, to stop possibility of the nuclear war, nuclear catastrophe. It's important direction of negotiation between Russia and the United States. And another issue is recovering of diplomatic relations between Russia and the United States, because under the Biden administration, the number of diplomats decreased almost 30 times. And I know that, for example, American diplomats who wanted to meet with me, they had a lot of difficulties to do this. And same Russian diplomats not able to meet with members of Congress and senators and so on. This is very important direction. And if you look at the Donald Trump narratives toward this Ukrainian crisis, I think it's a narrative of the New York developing businessman. He understands that Ukrainian war is business which is not profitable, and it's the business which has absolutely no chance to be profitable. That's why to stop it and to sell this business to somebody, to Europeans or to Russians or to Ukrainians.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Sergei Markov, former spokesperson for President Putin. Thank you very much for your time. Okay, well, do stay with us here on Al Arabiya News. We're going to take a short break, but stay with us for now.
At Al Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Al Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Berlin. For its exuberant urban life and vibrant art scene, visit Berlin. The German capital features a cultural scene and unique lifestyle that's both fast-paced and relaxed. Also known as the hipster city of Europe, Berlin keeps alive with its alternative cultures and styles. In neighborhoods like Kreuzberg, Neukölln, and Friedrichshain are vibrant places where locals simply chill and enjoy the relaxed open spaces and fresh air. No city in Germany is, in fact, greener than Berlin, with its forests, lakes, and sprawling parks. Berlin is also a city full of history. The World War II, after all, began and ended in the city of Berlin. Most popular are the Brandenburg Gate and the Federal Chancellery, which are reflective of the nation's rich stories. Germany's capital is also home to its major government buildings, such as the historic Reichstag or the seat of the German parliament. Of course, most remarkable are the Berlin Wall, the East Side Gallery, and the Holocaust Memorial. Historical feats aside, Berlin is also hip and happening with its streets of bars and clubs. The city has an active nightlife that guarantees massive parties and events practically every night. But the city is friendly to non-party goers too. It has relaxed beer gardens, small bars, hostels, and art galleries to suit different tastes. Famous as a city of art, Berlin has over 170 museums, including the famous Museum Island that puts treasures of the world on public display. Tourists often visit Berlin to attend ballets and operas at the city's major opera houses, as well as witness live performances by talented orchestras such as the world-class Berlin Philharmonic. And when it comes to food, Berlin has a lot to offer too. It's a great place for vegans. It has Turkish restaurants and supermarkets everywhere, and Italian, Mexican, and Asian food spots too. Food markets offering snacks, German wine and cheese, among others, will satisfy your palate as well. The neighborhoods in Kreuzberg and Neukölln are great for finding fine restaurants and quiet lounge bars, as well as dozens of coffee bars to enjoy. When it comes to shopping, there are well-known mainstream malls to visit, alongside independent boutiques nearby that offer endless choices for your lifestyle needs. One will also find small vintage stores within Berlin, some even selling second-hand books as well as high-end designer clothing.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
my campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Now turning our eye to Turkey, where mass protests erupted across the country following on from the arrest of Ekrem İmamoğlu, the mayor of Istanbul and the main opponent of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Well, İmamoğlu, who was expected to be selected as the Republican People's Party's 2028 presidential nominee in a vote on Sunday, was instead formally arrested and charged with corruption. In response to his arrest, unrest surged on Monday night, making for the worst demonstrations Turkey's seen in more than a decade. Well, İmamoğlu has stated that the charges against him are politically motivated. He said, quote, "I will never bow," on his X account, this before being remanded in custody. Well, President Erdogan has condemned the protests, accusing the CHP party of trying to disturb the peace and polarize Turkish citizens. Well, following Ekrem İmamoğlu's arrest, the European Commission urged Turkey to uphold democratic values as both a member of the European Council and EU candidate state. Well, the EU Commission spokesperson Guillaume Mercier made this statement.
The arrest of the mayor İmamoğlu and the protesters give rise to the questions regarding Turkey's adherence to its long-established democratic tradition. As a Council of Europe member and an EU candidate, Turkey must uphold democratic values. These rights, the rights of elected officials, as well as the right of peaceful demonstrations, need to be fully respected.
Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Professor Ayça Çubukçu, who is an associate professor in human rights at the London School of Economics. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. We've been hearing, obviously, throughout the course of the weekend, a lot of developments. The mayor of Istanbul was arrested and jailed. He faces corruption charges. He's accused of aiding a terrorist group. What do you read into the timing of all of this?
Well, the timing is critical. There's a peace process happening now in Turkey with the PKK. The arrest of the mayor of Istanbul coincided with this peace process, which is very much contested now. And it affects the dynamics on the ground, the kind of support Ekrem İmamoğlu has been able to garner from civil society and different political groups on the ground who are protesting in tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands across Turkey. The conjuncture is critical. Admittedly, it's quite difficult to interpret in terms of what is likely to happen now.
Okay, let's talk a bit more about Ekrem İmamoğlu himself. He's 53 years old, mayor of Istanbul. If there was an election in Turkey tomorrow, would he win it?
He is very likely to win it. You might be aware that yesterday, about 15 million citizens of Turkey, whether they're members of the CHP or not, participated in CHP's primaries to determine the presidential candidate. And he is now the official candidate. This is an unprecedented mobilization. Members of CHP as well as non-members have mobilized themselves, have voted in the primaries, and have determined Ekrem İmamoğlu as the presidential candidate of the opposition. So what we're seeing is extremely remarkable civic mobilization all across Turkey, from the largest cities to small towns. So I think this is a remarkable turning point in politics in Turkey.
And do you think the fact that he's been arrested and that he has clearly got a lot of support behind him indicates perhaps that President Erdogan views İmamoğlu as being a serious threat?
Of course, İmamoğlu is a serious threat to Erdogan's hold on power. And as the opposition claims, and I think they are right, because İmamoğlu is such a threat to Erdogan's power, he's been targeted through legal procedures. We see law being mobilized in Turkey against all kinds of opposition figures, activists, journalists, politicians. Kurdish politicians themselves are in jails in the thousands. And now CHP is the target of what we could call lawfare by the Turkish government.
Okay, and we're looking at some of the worst unrest that Turkey's seen, certainly in the last 10 years or so. It's being reported there have been demonstrations in 55 of the 81 provinces across Turkey. That's quite a large swathe of the country. Does the government look like it could be in some sort of danger at this point?
It depends. This is an unprecedented mobilization since the Gezi uprising in 2013. We've seen nothing like this in terms of scale of the protesters, the protests all across Turkey, in terms of the determination, in terms of composition. This is a wide let's say, coalition, for the lack of a better term, in the streets, being constituted in the streets. Is extremely diverse, and it poses a serious threat to Erdogan's power. Now, everything depends on how the Turkish government, Turkish judiciary, and the police will respond. It's as of midday today, more than 1,100 people have been arrested, detained in the protest, including students, journalists, and politicians of different persuasions, from left-wing groups to, just students who have been leading the protests across universities in Turkey. They have declared, tens of universities have declared through their students a boycott of classes, their calls for a general strike. It's difficult to guess and predict how things will unfold, but this is the most serious, I agree with many commentators, threat to Erdogan's power since the Gezi uprising in 2013.
Yeah, and if the economy was in good shape, perhaps he'd be in a stronger position. But it looks, just looking at the value of the Turkish lira as one indicator, it's now, I think today, 40 lira to 1 euro, when it was sort of 4 lira to 1 euro about 10 years ago. The economy's in dire straits. People really feeling the pain, aren't they? And I'm just wondering if Erdogan just cuts a very unpopular figure now in Turkey.
Well, simply put, the inflation rate is off the roofs. People from working classes to middle classes have seen a drop in their standards of living. There are millions of people living under poverty, if not starvation levels. There is a serious economic crisis as felt by the people of Turkey. Clearly, this has contributed to the unrest and demonstrations we're seeing. There appears to be little hope for the future. It's not only a matter of the violation of human rights and civil rights, the situation of the economy and the real difficulties people are having just to live and subsist on a daily basis, given unemployment, given the depreciation of the Turkish lira, given the inflation rate, I think are certainly contributing to the determination and the strength with which they have taken to the streets so far.
Okay, just lastly, I mean, obviously very difficult to predict what happens next, and you've already touched on the difficulties of forecasting where we go to from here. So why don't we look backwards instead? Recep Tayyip Erdogan himself was arrested in 1999, and he then went on to become the country's prime minister and then president. He's been a mainstay for the last 22 years or so. I mean, that's a major reversal of fortunes that he had. And I'm just wondering whether there have been other examples, haven't there, of politicians who've served some time in prison only to have a dramatic reversal of fortunes and a dramatic comeback.
Yes.
Do you think the same could happen for Ekrem İmamoğlu?
It could happen. We should remember that Selahattin Demirtas, the co-chair of the pro-Kurdish, then HDP party, has been in jail also, and he's now joined by Ekrem İmamoğlu. Demirtas has been behind bars for years, and it's very difficult to predict if İmamoğlu will be released, and if so, when. All I can say is that everything seems possible right now, and all depends on the determination of the people on the streets and on how the Turkish government will react in response to that in the coming days.
Okay, we'll keep a close eye on what happens there in Turkey. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Professor Ayça Çubukçu at LSE in London. Thank you. In other news, an Israeli airstrike on a hospital in Gaza killed a senior Hamas leader and an aide on Sunday evening. Ismail Barhoum, the head of the group's financial affairs, was killed in a strike on the Nasser hospital, which is the main medical facility in Khan Yunis. Well, he'd been receiving treatment at that hospital after being wounded in an airstrike a few days earlier. Well, Israel's military said it had struck a key Hamas member operating inside the hospital compound following, quote, an extensive intelligence gathering process, adding that precise munitions had been used in order to mitigate harm. Meanwhile, Gaza's health ministry announced at the weekend more than 50,000 Palestinians are now known to have been killed in the Israel-Hamas war, including more than 700 who've been killed since Israel resumed its bombardment last week. Well, let's get more analysis. We can speak now to Aaron David Miller, former U.S. Middle East peace negotiator, who joins us from Washington. Great to have you with us once again. It appears that the Nasser hospital in Khan Yunis was struck on Sunday night. A senior Hamas figure, we're being told, was killed. What's actually left of Hamas, do you think, at this stage?
Oh, I think quite a bit. If you believe former Secretary of State Tony Blinken, who in December essentially said that Hamas had recruited nearly the number of fighters that the Israelis had taken off the battlefield over the course of the last year and a half. Look, I think the group is no longer capable of functioning as an organized military organization. Its capacity to launch high-trajectory weapons, rockets, has been decimated. Maybe 50% of the tunnel structure, but probably no more, eliminated. But look, you know, the notion that you can't kill an idea, that may be true, but very little has been done over the last year and a half to make that idea less relevant. That is, to create an alternative to Hamas's abysmal governorship of Gaza and their catastrophic decision on October 7, which has led not just to their defeat on the military basis as an organized concept, but to the hollowing out of Hezbollah and the end of Hassan Nasrallah. Nonetheless, they're going to maintain themselves as an insurgency capable of influencing through intimidation or co-optation much of what happens in post-conflict Gaza.
We're being told that more than 50,000 people have now been killed in Gaza since October the 7th. I mean, when and where do you think Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will draw the line? I mean, what's his vision for peace, and does he even have one?
I don't think he has a vision for what you and I might, or most people would conclude as peace between Israelis and Palestinians, either in Gaza or, frankly, on the broader issue of what to do about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think he's driven largely by one reality. I mean, he's the most astute, willful politician, skillful politician on the Israeli scene today. At the same time, he's been on trial for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust in a Jerusalem district court 4 years in running. He must maintain himself in power. If he doesn't, he faces the possibility of a conviction, or perhaps more likely a plea agreement that would mean the end of his political career. So that means presiding, as he has since December of 2022, over the most right-wing government in Israel's history. And most everything he does, certainly with respect to Gaza, is done with a view of how to strengthen his hold on power, not weaken it.
I mean, loads was happening at the weekend in Israel. There were protests against Prime Minister Netanyahu. He dismissed the head of Shin Bet. There was a no confidence vote in Israel's Attorney General. And I was going to ask you whether Netanyahu's position looks weak and whether those actions should be viewed as him somehow trying to shore up his position. What's your interpretation?
Well, no, I think the resumption of the war is critically important to keeping its coalition intact. I mean, you've seen that the decision on January 18 to accept the Israel-Hamas agreement basically led to the leaving of the government by Itamar Ben-Gvir. Bezalel Smotrich, the other extremist minister in the Prime Minister's coalition, agreed to stay only if the Prime Minister resumed the war. So I think the battlefield is connected to the political field. And right now, the Prime Minister has a budget to pass. If he doesn't by the end of March, the government will fall. He has an ultra-Orthodox conscription bill, needs to figure out a way to manage. And as you pointed out, he's already taken action to fire Ronen Bar, unprecedented in the history of Israel, that any Shin Bet director, several have resigned, but none have been fired. And he's laying the groundwork for getting rid of the Israeli Attorney General. For all of this, he needs a strong, coherent right-wing coalition. So I think that's his priority right now.
I mean, there are, of course, those 59 hostages who remain in Gaza. We don't know exactly how many of them are alive, but we can assume probably at least 20 of them. I mean, in terms of going about getting them released, I mean, what is Benjamin Netanyahu's best course of action? Because he seems to have veered quite considerably from that roadmap that was drawn up by the Egyptians and the Qataris.
Yeah, well, the most charitable, well, as far as the roadmap is concerned, that the three-phased agreement that the Biden administration conceptualized and negotiated, and the Trump administration in the several days before his inauguration pushed over the goal line. The notion that Israel and Hamas would ever be able to implement a phase two, I think, was never in the cards. The hope, of course, was that if you had 6 weeks of quiet, maybe Israeli and Palestinian publics would press their respective leaders for a cessation of the war. Obviously, that did not happen. And I think the most charitable interpretation, and I use the word charitable, it's sort of an anomaly given the fact that so many Palestinian civilians have been killed just in the resumption of this recent Israeli offensive. But the most charitable interpretation is that the Israeli government has upped the pressure on Hamas to get them back to the negotiating table. And there are reports this morning, as you know, out of Cairo, per Egyptian sources, that Hamas has agreed to a proposal to release 5 hostages in exchange for a resumption of the ceasefire. That's the most charitable interpretation. I think, frankly, in terms of avenging the dead or redeeming the living, that Mr. Netanyahu was much more focused on figuring out a way to continue the war against Hamas, to try to eradicate it as a military organization. And I think it's going to be difficult, to say the least, but to end its political influence in Gaza. I think that's his priority because, frankly, that priority coincides very nicely with his political interests.
I mean, hundreds of Palestinians, more than 700, have been killed since Tuesday of last week. I mean, clearly, that ceasefire deal that we were just talking about there hasn't had the desired effect, certainly not in the last week or so. Who's to blame, in your opinion?
Well, I stopped doing that very long ago after working on these issues over the last 27 years on the broader issues, not of war making, but of peacemaking. Look, I think there's one basic reality here that external parties need to accept, and that is the limitations of their influence. When two parties, in this case, the current Israeli government and Hamas, are engaged in conflicts that they consider to be existential or near existential for both of them, either from a security point of view or from their own political interests, the role of outside parties, the influence, the pressure that they can bring is really quite limited. And frankly, the international community has been feckless, divided, self-interested, basically incapable. And I might add that the Arab world has not shown itself with rare distinction either. They have presided over the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza without doing anything, either to break their relations with Israel or even pressure the United States to get tougher with the Netanyahu government. So everybody has a hand in this, but the two primary combatants, Hamas started this on October 7th. We wouldn't be having this conversation had they not decided to engage in this, just this millennialist notion that somehow if they could inflict a degree of pain on Israeli civilians unprecedented in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which they managed to do, that somehow the region would explode. Arab governments would be under pressure to break their ties with Israel. The Iranians and the Israelis would get into a major war that would plunge the Middle East into chaos and confusion, and Hamas would claim credit somehow for I don't know what. So Hamas started this, but it played into the hands, clearly, of an Israeli government that had no intention, in my judgment, of ever being serious with respect to negotiating a broader Israeli-Palestinian agreement. The last time we tried to do this, the last best chance, I'm saying this not because I was one of the 12 Americans who participated in it, because it was the last time that an empowered Israeli prime minister, a president who really cared about this, and a Palestinian leader who actually had control over the Palestinian national movement engaged in an effort to push for a permanent deal on border security, refugees, Jerusalem, and end of all conflict and claims. And by the end of that summit at Camp David in July 2000, the gaps between Israelis and Palestinians were as wide as the Grand Canyon. The suspicion, mistrust greatly accelerated, and nothing that has occurred in the last 24 years has done anything other than expand those gaps. So you talk about responsibility, it's never one hand clapping.
Just to pick up on one of the things you said that stood out for me, you said, you know, that was the last time there was a president who actually cared. You're obviously talking about a US president here. Are you suggesting President Trump doesn't care about the situation in Gaza?
Look, I think Donald Trump's conception of the national interest is subordinated, or of the American national interest, is subordinated and tethered to his own interests, financial interests, his politics, his vanities, his pet projects, his grievances. So do I think Donald Trump cares enough to actually focus in a way that would be required of any US president, the way Jimmy Carter focused, the way George H.W. Bush focused, the way Bill Clinton focused, even the way Barack Obama focused, which was not nearly as intensely as the other three, certainly not as much effort was expended as was expended by Carter and Clinton. No, I don't think Donald Trump, I don't think that's his priority. It's domestic in large part, and it's trying to figure out a way to get a quick deal to end the Russia-Ukraine war, to normalize relations with Vladimir Putin. And I think if you got to ask me about the relative importance of Gaza in comparison with that, I think Gaza occupies very little of the president's attention. Should he be interested at some point in an Israeli-Saudi normalization deal, which would win him a Nobel, at least that's, I suspect, what he thinks, then perhaps, for that reason, he may be able to bring the kind of focus that is required, but certainly not now.
Well, he did have a plan, a very original one for Gaza. Unfortunately, not many people in the region particularly appreciated it. But on that note, the Israeli government has announced some plans for a special agency, which is going to be for the, quote, voluntary departure of Gazans. I'm just wondering, this is my last question to you, what you think that's about, and should we join the dots and see a link between that and what President Trump proposed, which was to turn Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East and for Gazans to go live somewhere else?
Trump's proposal, in my judgment, wasn't serious. I mean, it sent a lot of people in the region scurrying around trying to figure out how to avoid responsibility. The Egyptians at an Arab summit basically put on the table, a 90-page plan, probably prepared by some consultancy, which the Trump administration reacted in a kind of lukewarm manner, and the Israelis danced around it. They didn't like it either. So no, I think Donald Trump's notion of turning Gaza into the Riviera by displacing its inhabitants never made any sense. This idea on the Israelis, which essentially builds on some of the ideas that Trump put out there, I don't think is serious in the sense that it could actually ever be implemented. I do believe, however, that the Israelis will try to determine how many Gazans might actually want to leave. I don't know what that number is, but it's, again, part of the notion that the only answer in the minds of certainly many right-wing Israelis is a whole new configuration, either to empty Gaza of its inhabitants or alternatively to create a situation where the Israeli military, because there's no security architecture there, and I don't think anything is on the cusp of being created that would replace the Israelis, and they're not going to withdraw all their forces in the wake of October 7th, to somehow turn Gaza into a sort of free fire zone. I don't think they want to militarily occupy it. Yes, there are many in Israel, I suppose, on the right who would like to see Gaza resettled after Ariel Sharon, the late Ariel Sharon, withdrew Israeli forces and dismantled the 8,000 settlers and the settlements there in 2005. But no, I think this Israeli government has no real plan that in the end would redound to better governance in Gaza, more security, and most important, Gaza first, not as Gaza only. That some solution to Gaza would give way to a broader negotiation between Israelis and Palestinians to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I don't see that happening anytime soon, and I certainly don't see this Israeli government committed to advancing any part of it.
But if there's no food and no humanitarian aid entering Gaza, and the Israeli government's got ideas like this to resettle people, I mean, it's very hard to look at those two facts independently of one another.
I think that's right. And I think any of the scores of plans by think tanks, governments in the Arab world, in Europe, in the US, to basically create a soft landing. And again, I use that word not to trivialize the amount of death and destruction that Gazans have suffered over the course of the last year and a half. It seems hard for me to imagine because you have three huge obstacles that stand in the way. What or who is going to replace the Israelis with respect to preventing Hamas's resurgence? Number two, who or what is going to replace Hamas? And number three, what to do about the very real tragic situation of an entire generation of Palestinians who have been scarred by what has happened over the course of the last year and a half, the physical destruction, not to mention the emotional and psychological destruction of what's occurred. And I don't have answers. And frankly, I don't think anyone has good answers to overcoming those three problems. And that's why I think the situation there is going to get worse before it gets worse.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. Always a pleasure talking to you. Aaron David Miller, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.
Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
In 2018, Maria Butina was convicted of working as an unregistered Russian foreign agent in the US. She was jailed and then deported to Russia. Butina has always denied being a Russian spy, and at the time, President Vladimir Putin said he had never heard of her. Well, she now serves as a parliamentarian in the Russian State Duma and is a supporter of the Russian military offensive in Ukraine. Maria Butina, good to have you on the show. Now, let's start with the latest developments in Ukraine. Following the recent round of escalation and the warnings issued by President Putin, do you fear the world is now closer to nuclear war than at any other point in your lifetime?
Well, I don't know, because I haven't been in other points of our world's life, like the Cuban Missile Crisis or Caribbean Missile Crisis, depends, where you live and how you call it. But I think we are now in quite low point of the relationships between Russia and the West, and that's put the whole world in the danger.
You know, the numbers of casualties are difficult to calculate, and they're disputed by both sides. But after the 1,000-day milestone was passed, how are the Russian people managing to accept the losses of their sons, and do they clearly know what the sacrifice is for?
They absolutely do. And I was elected from a small region, Kirovsky Oblast, which is located in about 1.5-hour flight from Moscow. And I should tell you that we're all united and we help to the front lines, and we cry for those who are, lost their lives, sacrificing them for our motherland. But we all understand that this is a necessary thing to do, because we are trying to help to the Russians in their new territories, Russian new territories, that's first. And the second, which I view very, very important, we actually are fighting for survival of Russia and the whole world, because we see that Nazism in a full scale is back, and we have to stop it. We absolutely have to stop it.
There are arguments put forward, though, that the Russian people don't necessarily know the full story because of the control of the media there. How can Russian people make a clear decision if they don't have a full idea of what's going on?
Oh, come on, they have quite a full idea what's going on, because, you know, you can go on Telegram channels and you read a lot of stuff from both sides, and people understand what's going on. And even if little villages, people don't rely on TV anymore that much. Only 50% of Russian population is TV watchers. Most of them actually go on social networking and they talk to each other. And, you know, you cannot hide the truth. And the truth is that SMO should have been started, because NATO was coming so close to our borders that it would put the whole world in the actual stance of the Third World War. So we were protecting Russian-speaking population, and we absolutely understand how important it is to make a step forward today. So people do know the truth and they see the truth. And people who come back from the front lines and they're on their vacation, they tell the truth, that how horrible actions are committed by what horrible crimes are committed by the Ukrainian forces that are joined by the NATO forces. Well, we didn't place NATO next to our borders. NATO placed themselves, and they broke their promises. Well, all Russians know it. So we're kind of, you know, smart and intellectual to be able to find out what is true and what is not. And people do it and manage it very well.
And of course, there are accusations from both sides about abuses on the battlefield. But as the new administration comes into the U.S., eyes are turning towards a peace deal. I want to get your perspective on what you regard as a fair peace deal to end the war.
I don't know. Look, first of all, I don't know if the U.S. administration, the new one, is actually credible in terms of what they say and what they do. Because the last time when Trump came to power, I was living in the United States those days, and then they made me to serve prison time for actually peace building in the US, and Trump was in charge. So he was promising to make good relationships with Russia, but in fact, we had more sanctions and more diplomats expelled, and people were more and more distant, removed from each other. I mean, the US people and the Russians that had ever been. So they say they want to stop the conflict. Do they really want to do so? I don't know. And for right now, I do believe that the US is way more focused on the Israel-Palestinian situation than on Ukraine and Russia, because they clearly understand by now that Russia is going to win. There is no options. And the people, they know the truth, and they're going to, fight until the last breath. I mean, the Russians. And Ukraine will lose. There is no other way. And additionally to that, now there are so many people fleeing the West, moving to Russia, that you have to be blind not to see that not just the war on a war field is lost by the West, but they also lost the war for the minds and souls of people if they're moving to Russia. Well, I know I handle this program in the Russian parliament, and I can see every single day more and more people come in with families. They just hate LGBT stuff, and they want to live and raise their families and kids in a peaceful community which they view Russia. So we struggle now how to get so many people in, because they come and there are a lot of them, and they're investors and they have money and do all this stuff. So it's quite surprising for me. But it means the West lost the battle for the souls and for the hearts of the people as well.
Well, the report of there haven't been many reports in terms of people moving to Russia on the Western side. Perhaps that wouldn't be surprising. But either way, both Presidents Putin and Trump are regarded as tough negotiators. Who do you regard as the stronger of the two? And do you expect any compromise from President Putin on his objectives?
I expect not a compromise, but I expect a consensus. I mean, I expect both sides to focus on what is profitable for each side, but not on the losses and compromises of which one. And I do believe that this is the only way how to negotiate. Well, first, number one thing that the US should do, they just take their selves out of Europe, because that's not their land. That's not their decision. That's not their solution. There is not their land. They had to get out and let people, Europeans, to decide themselves how they want to live, because they now press every single country in Europe, all the countries, to just, follow their will, but they shall not have any power here. There is no reason. And they're just, flooding Europe with their money and trying to buy politicians. That's what, in fact, they do. And that's not the peaceful negotiations. Whom to negotiate with? European countries, including Ukraine now, they lost their sovereignty. They cannot just freely talk anymore, which means that if you want a peaceful, a good deal, the US should step back and realize that this is not their land.
Let me get your perspective, Ms. Butina, on how life has changed for ordinary people in Russia since the war began. How have the economic sanctions been felt? What impact are they having?
Well, we have full grocery stores. We don't have any problems central heating. We don't have any skyrocket prices. We're actually fine. The main thing that changed, and this is absolutely true, that we're all now stand together side by side, because any time when in Russia some external force is trying to push us, we become more and more united. That's what happened. So now I see a lot of patriotism in Russia, because we know that we have to be close to each other to stand against NATO. Like, that's not a secret anymore. There is no just Ukraine. This is now NATO fighting by Ukrainian lives. That's how it's called, which means that Russians do understand, and they stand side by side. And now we are welcoming new foreigners who come, join us and help us. This is what's going on. This is the average mood in Russia. Yes, the hardships, but we used to live in the hardships. Look, they had it during their Second World War, the Great Patriotic War. And yeah, we know how to sorrow, but on the other hand, this is how we used to live. So by external pressure, you cannot conquer Russia. Our empire has been lost for the last ages and ages, and will stand ages to come. It's one of the longest standing empires in the world, multinational. So we're going to be okay. Hard times, but it will make us stronger.
Well, so presumably the reports of increased inflation must be having an impact on the day-to-day lives, and will start to test the will of the Russian people.
I don't think so. We have challenges on our will every single day, and because of the living and the weather conditions. So we're kind of used to go through hardships. But talking of inflation, yeah, there are hard times. People understand that, and they just work hard. And actually sanctions open new opportunities for us, because the companies that used to be very small now became big, because now we don't have Western products, and they have to take the market, and they love to take the market share. And we have a lot of partners in the BRICS countries that help us, and they want to trade, and we explore new brands. So we don't suffer at all. Meaning that it's not just the US who produces all the things. It's not just Europe. Europe needs Russia because of the gas and and oil and all this stuff. Russia has all the resources in the world. Why would we suffer?
Ms. Butina, I'm just looking at your past, and you lived in America for a while. Of course, it was a difficult time for you. You're accused of being a Russian operative and so on. But are you personally surprised or even saddened by the state of relations between Russia and America? And how do you think the ordinary people in both countries reflect the views of the leadership?
I am sad, because when I came to the States, I expected the American dream to be like we saw in the Hollywood movies in the 70s and the 80s. I expected conservative America, and I expected people who just, have one wonderful yard and they have wonderful families, and America has none of that. Like, not anymore. It's just they lost the country. And now all of that I see here in Russia. And it's just, the world is upside down, indeed. Do I think that people actually share the views of the US government? Well, I don't know, because I see so many people moving from the States, and they hate the government. Well, and they don't like Russia maybe necessarily, but they don't hate us, because people are people. And I actually serve time for having friendship dinners that were paid, by the way, by Americans. And like, I don't know why I became a Russian agent then, but anyway. So, and the friendship dinners just showed that people want to talk. That's why I support now the civil diplomacy. Well, I did serve time for civil diplomacy, but I was and I am a peace builder, and I will do it in the future because I believe, and you're absolutely right, if people talk to each other, they don't hate each other. And this is the only way how we can never ever have the Third World War, because that's my great hope. I don't want any serious conflict between Russia and NATO, because, you know, the whole world will suffer.
Well, you know, you obviously must have made friends during that time in America. As you said, you had dinners with them and so on. In spite of your conviction as an unregistered operative in the country, do you have any particular regrets, and are you still in touch with any of those people?
Yeah, actually, yes. Some of them incognito, but they come here to Russia. It's very sad that we cannot communicate so much because they're afraid of the US government, that they're going to reach them and, you know, cut them and throw them in prison because I'm under sanctions. And so I don't want to put them in danger as well. But they do travel here because this is friendship. Friendship is eternal. Love is eternal. These are the values that the US lost, but there are still people who are like this. And no, I do not hate the United States. I do not hate Americans, because if I do, it means that the bad guys win. So I don't want them to win. That's why I stay faithful. I believe in God. I am conservative, and I will fight for peace until my last breath.
Let me ask you, you know, as in the conversation, you always denied being a Russian spy. So what do you think was the reason the justice system there pursued the case and put you in jail? Was it bureaucracy, do you think, or do you think there was a political reason behind it?
I was never accused of being a spy, okay? That's in the first place. Never. It was in the media. It had never been in my conviction, had never been even filed as a paper. And they needed a scapegoat. They needed someone physically to actually arrest at the day when Trump and Putin met. Look at the day of my arrest. Do you think it's a coincidence? They arrested me exactly when President Putin, President Trump were first time to meet, sit in front of each other, and they have this very, very loud case. Because somebody in the US, they don't want peace. They want war because they earn on wars. The private military companies are earning a lot of having wars all over the globe. Question is to us, to Russia, to Europeans, Arabs, Chinese, and all other countries. How long are we gonna let them do that? Are earning money on our life losses? I don't think that's smart. So they needed a scapegoat. They got a scapegoat. And look, if they would have even one piece of evidence that I am a spy, would they let me go in 18 months? No way. I would serve 35 years now, but there was nothing on me. Absolutely nothing. That's why they just wanted the public case and just throw me out of the country, claim I'm the national security threat. Yeah, you can see I'm very much a threat. And then just, you know, make it, and they're still having fun on my case, saying like, oh, look, if she met someone, that means she, you know, had relationships. They never ever shown one picture. And as a woman, I'm deeply insulted by that, because they were claiming Alma this relationship with someone. There is no one picture being made. Isn't it suspicious? Well, because it had never happened. This is a fictitious, fake case. This is how Trump says this is fake news.
Well, either way, they put you in prison. Didn't that change your view of the United States at all?
No. No, because people are people, and corrupted guys in the government are corrupted guys in the government. And, you know, one thing has changed in me after prison and during my prison time. I spent 4 months on solitary confinement, which is against all the conventions against tortures, but forget about it. I found God, or God found me, I don't know. But I know one thing, that I shall not hate, and I do not hate. I forgive them. It doesn't mean I should forget, but I forgive them. So, and the bad guys, they will pay their price, because you know what? God is just. This is what I believe. I don't need to do any revenge on them. No, that's not my job. God will do everything. And all the people who acted badly, they will get their punishment no matter what. Even if we do nothing and just sitting and watching that, the justice is going to get.
So if you have moved on, but, you know, don't you really want to clear your name officially in the US?
I actually tried. I filed an appeal case, but the problem is that when you're sentenced in the US, you lose your right to appeal because you sign a special paper. Oh, they don't sentence you ever. That's the law. That you cannot appeal and you don't want to appeal, which is maybe sad. And I was very excited when Duran's report got out because there is nothing on me there, because that was the case that they actually based my conviction of, meaning the money that supposedly went from Kremlin to Trump. And then look at the Duran report, there was no money. The question is, why did I serve my time? So would I try to prove that I'm not guilty in the US court now? No, because it's corrupted. It does not make sense. I'll just lose money. In the future, maybe. Well, yes, it's insulting that my name was placed in dirt, because I'm from a family, a very distinguished family of teachers, and I'm a teacher by myself. I've always been a peace builder, and I teach kids. And now kids look at me, saying like, oh, this is a, whatever they call her, a Russian honeypot. I've never been. And this is an insult, but there will be a day. I know there will be a day. And the history will place everything on its deserving spots.
Well, of course, when you were deported from America to Russia, in the American eyes, you were seen as a spy. I'm curious, how were you regarded in Russia? I know Vladimir Putin said he'd never heard of you at the time.
No, well, he mentioned my name a couple of times, but why should he? Meaning I was just a student. That's the thing. I was just a student. Yes, my country fought for me because I'm a Russian citizen, and now I am having this parliament position of fighting for those who are oppressed and are in the prisons because they are Russians. There are a lot of them. And every single person here will stand for a Russian because, we know that tomorrow you will be at this spot. And, well, I do my job here. I'm a lawmaker. I help to people who move into Russia from the West. That's my responsibility today, and I'm very excited to do so. I do have a lot of work. No weekend, no vacation, not because I'm suffering, but because I love my job. That's why, because I love helping people. I used to be a peacemaker. I love helping people. That's what I do today. I help people in prison, and they put me on solitary again for that. I don't care. I know what I do, and I do it for God. And people will do no harm for me because God is with me. Who are people if God is with me?
Yeah, I was wondering about your visit to the Russian opposition activist Alexei Navalny in jail when he was on hunger strike. Why did you do that, and what did he say to you?
He was complaining that he has so bad conditions, so I wanted to check. And I went there, and I saw that he's lying. And I said straight to his eyes, and unfortunately, he didn't grant a permission to show the footage of what he was talking to me. He called me, well, I won't pronounce it because I'm a woman and I don't want this to be, public again, but he called me very bad words that is, I think, inappropriate from man to say to a woman, and it's unproven. He just repeated the US claims. It was insulting, but anyway, that was not my goal. I told the cameras and the camera crew from the very beginning, because look, I almost died. I went through tortures. I know what tortures are. And if I see just a sign that he's like that, I would stop it, because I would never let my country do what they did with me in the US. I lost my health. I lost my reputation, everything for doing nothing. So when I went there, I just wanted to ask how he's doing. And if he needs any help, I do help people to prisons all the time. But he was just fine. He was just cursing me out and just wanted to have, PRI on everything. And I don't know why he did it. I don't know, because I am happy to help. And it doesn't matter if you're an accuser of me, if you're, my former FBI agent, I will always help. That's my nature. And it was so horrible and painful that he was just, I don't know why he did so. I mean, I can see some of his mind.
Based on what you just said, Ms. Butina, considering his reaction to you and you were surprised by his very negative behavior with you, first of all, were you surprised when he died in prison? And secondly, having found religion, did you pray for him? Because religion involves forgiveness.
Absolutely. Absolutely. every single moment. And actually, when he got sick first time after that plane flight, that was, and God will judge me if I'm lying here, because the first thing there was a COVID time, and I remember it was in my apartment, and I was praying hard, so he gets through it, and God gave him another chance, and he went through it. And the second time the same. I will pray especially for people who hate me, especially for people who curse me out, because I am a Jesus Christ believer. That's it. You can't change it. Well, you can't explain it for a person who is non-believer, but absolutely yes. And again, if his wife tomorrow shows up and she needs my help, I will help. If tomorrow people who curse me out and, you know, place me in prison, throw me on solitary are gonna pray for my help, I will pray for them and I will help, because God says me to do so. It's in the Bible. I will follow the Bible, because I know that this life now is nothing comparatively to what is ahead. So I it's hard to explain the face. It's just, it is. I'm helping now here. We have a group of traditional Catholics that were, you know, in the US called domestic terrorists in the FBI note, and many of them now moved to Russia. I am a Russian Orthodox. Why would I help them to establish here a church? They are legal now, they're registered, it's all okay. They have a little chapel now, but I want for them better conditions. I'm not Catholic, why shall I do so? Because I'm Christian. Okay?
Well, so, you know,
help to a Muslim, to a Christian, to anyone who needs help.
On that note, I wanted to touch a bit on your work as a politician in Russia now, and you've touched on this issue of helping people to resettle from the West into Russia. I'd indicated earlier it's not something widely reported in the media in the West, but how important is that as a project for you, and what's your real motivation for doing it?
Well, my real motivation is to help people, because nothing makes me more happy. Well, you can call me selfish and egoistic, but that's what gives me joy. Helping others. When I see all these families setting up and having their houses and having jobs and their kids, you know, step by step learning Russian language and, you know, telling me stories about their own culture. I have this wonderful, fantastic family of Joseph Schutzman. He's an American who moved to Russia recently. He has seven kids and 3 girls. And these 3 girls asked me to translate Russian fairy tales into English. Well, I'm not great in translating fairy tales, but it's so charming. So for me, the motivation is, it's just the soul. Well, I don't know if my soul is pure because I'm the worst sinner you could imagine. Well, because I have to confess all the time, because I misstep all the time. But you know, I just have joy when people smile and people have their lives and families and they live as conservatives, and it's wonderful. Yeah, we have this program, and actually we just established a group called Welcome to Russia, and I serve on the board. We also have people there with dual citizenship from Germany and France and Australia and Austria, and so those are now Russian citizens. They serve on the board with me because we you know hold hands. We're holding hands to help to those who are looking for the Salvation Ark, and the Salvation Ark today for conservatives is Russia, and the word gets out. So we have many applications from those people.
Well, let me ask you, Ms. Butina, do you think more people will move if there is a peace deal?
I don't think it's related. Well, the number one reason why people come here is because they believe in God, they're conservatives, and they hate and they do not accept LGBT agenda. Well, if the US will come back being a conservative state and they stop the LGBT propaganda, then maybe people just, you know, always prefer to keep their homes. But you should understand, they come not because they want to, they come out of necessity, because they know that their kids are trained now and against your will as parents to become LGBT, so you lose your future. So people come here not because they necessarily love Russia, but because they're looking for a safe place where they actually survive and they keep their cultural ancestries until their world and the times to come. That's why. So I don't think it's related to Ukraine or Russia or any military zone. It's more related to their hearts and souls.
It's an interesting point you raise about the LGBT community. What's the situation for those already in Russia? What's their current prospect?
Well, the LGBT in Russia is banned. And absolutely, the whole movement cannot propagate. You cannot go on the streets and do parades and we are very proud of that. We're very proud that we have God in our constitution. We are very proud that we have mother and father in our constitution, because we don't take any other gender, because God created us this way. And yes, Russia is a conservative state today, and yes, LGBT is not welcome here, okay? I think that's fine. We don't put people on a treatment or something, but okay, whatever you believe, but you have not bring it to the kids at schools, not on the streets. You cannot do propaganda of LGBT, and you cannot have any official or unofficial movements of LGBT community. Okay, that's just our country. We're a sovereign country. That's what we decided. This is the path we decided for ourselves.
Well, Maria Butina, I thank you very much for making the time to join the show.
Thank you.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deep fake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
my campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.